What if the oldest pyramid on Earth was not in Egypt, but hidden beneath an Indonesian hillside that no one thought to question? What if this pyramid was not built 400-500 years ago like the Great Pyramid of Giza, but 27,000 years ago, before the last age ended, before agriculture was supposed to exist, before humans were supposed to possess any knowledge of architecture or engineering? What if one discovery, one structure buried beneath jungle and soil in West Java, could rewrite everything we know about when civilization began, how it developed, and what came before the oldest cities we have found? From the volcanic highlands of Indonesia to the laboratories where scientists argue over radiocarbon dates, from ancient legends of sacred mountains to modern ground, penetrating radar scans revealing impossible geometry, one site has emerged that challenges the very foundation of human history. A site that archaeologists dismissed for a century as a natural hill with some recent stone arrangements. A site that locals revered as holy ground without knowing what truly lay beneath their feet. A site that, when finally investigated with modern technology, revealed construction so ancient and so sophisticated that accepting its existence requires abandoning everything we have been taught about the timeline of human achievement. Today, that site waits, mostly unexcavated, politically controversial, academically threatening, holding secrets that institutional archaeology would prefer remain buried, holding evidence that, if fully accepted, means our textbooks are wrong, our timelines are compressed, and our understanding of human capability is fundamentally incomplete, holding proof that we are not the first civilization to rise on this planet, only the latest, and perhaps not even the most advanced. Before this discovery changes how you see the past, how you understand civilization, and how you think about the future, take a moment to hit like and subscribe to the channel. But only if you are ready to question everything you were taught in school. Only if you are willing to consider that the story of human progress is longer, stranger, and more fragile than we have been told. And if you are still with me now, share in the comments where you are listening from and what time keeps you company. I imagine this story, buried for 27,000 years, crossing continents and centuries to reach you tonight, wherever you are, whenever you listen. And so our story begins not with answers but with a hill in West Java, Indonesia. A hill that was never just a hill. The local people called it Gunung Padang. The name translates roughly to Mountain of Enlightenment or Mountain of Light, depending on which linguistic interpretation you prefer. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the site had been considered sacred. Pilgrims climbed its terraced slopes to meditate, to pray, to seek spiritual clarity at the summit. The hill rose from the surrounding landscape with a peculiar regularity. 5 distinct terraces stepping up the hillside in a pattern that seemed almost too organized to be natural. And scattered across these terraces, half buried in soil and vegetation, were columnar stones. Basalt columns formed by ancient volcanic activity, their hexagonal shapes the natural result of lava cooling slowly and cracking into geometric patterns. To the casual observer, to the farmers who worked the surrounding rice fields, to the pilgrims who climbed the hill on religious journeys, the stone seemed like a happy accident of geology. Nature creating a sacred space through volcanic processes. The terraces, perhaps carved by erosion over countless centuries. The stones, volcanic columns that had broken free from some ancient lava flow and tumbled into their current arrangement. There was no reason to think otherwise. No reason to question. No reason to imagine that beneath the soil, beneath the vegetation, beneath layers of earth that had accumulated over thousands of years, something impossible waited. In 1914, during the Dutch colonial period, a surveyor named N.J. Krom conducted the first archaeological assessment of Gunung Padang. His report was brief and dismissive. Natural hill with some megalithic stones on the surface, possibly arranged in recent centuries for religious purposes. No significant archaeological value. The site was noted, catalogued, and forgotten by the academic world. It remained a local pilgrimage destination, nothing more. Decades passed. Indonesia gained independence. The hill continued to sit unchanged, unremarkable to those who did not know what to look for. Then in 1979, an Indonesian archaeologist named Pon Parnadi visited the site and noticed something that previous observers had missed. The terraces were too regular, too precise, the angles too deliberate, the spacing too intentional. He measured the stone arrangements and found patterns suggesting human construction rather than natural formation. He filed a report suggesting that Gunung Padang might be more than a natural hill, that the megalithic stones might represent an ancient structure of considerable sophistication. His report was acknowledged, added to archaeological records, and largely ignored. The site remained classified as a natural formation with some minor megalithic additions, probably from the last few thousand years. Nothing to challenge the established understanding of Indonesian prehistory. Nothing to warrant major investigation or funding. For another 30 years, the hill continued to keep its secrets. Pilgrims climbed. Locals respected it as sacred ground. Archaeologists focused their attention elsewhere, on sites that fit comfortably within the known timeline, on discoveries that confirmed rather than challenged the established narrative of how and when civilization developed in Southeast Asia. Gunung Padang remained a footnote, a minor site, a natural hill with some stones. Interesting but not important. Until 2010, the year everything changed, the year someone decided to look beneath the surface. Danny Hilman Nattowijaja was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist, a senior researcher at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, specializing in earthquake research and geophysics. His background was in understanding Earth's structure, in using technology to see what lay hidden beneath soil and rock. When he first heard about Gunung Padang, about the local traditions claiming the hill was ancient and sacred, about the dismissed archaeological reports suggesting something more than natural formation, his geological curiosity was triggered. Not archaeological interest. Geological puzzle solving. If the hill was natural, geophysical surveys would show natural rock formations, irregular patterns, the chaotic signatures of volcanic and erosional processes. But if it was constructed, if humans had built something here, the surveys would reveal organized geometry, the unmistakable signatures of deliberate design. He assembled a team. Geophysicists, geologists, a few archaeologists willing to collaborate despite the site's reputation as insignificant. They brought ground-penetrating radar, the kind used to map underground structures without digging. They brought seismic tomography equipment, which sends sound waves into the earth and measures how they bounce back, revealing density changes that indicate different materials. They brought electrical resistivity imaging, which maps underground features by measuring how easily electricity flows through different substances. Stone conducts differently than soil. Air cavities conduct differently than solid rock. Constructed chambers create signatures distinct from natural geology. The team began their surveys in 2010, expecting perhaps to confirm some minor megalithic construction on the surface, to document a few stone arrangements, to add some details to the archaeological record, and to move on to other projects. Instead, the first radar scans stopped them cold, because what appeared on the computer screens was not the irregular, chaotic pattern of natural geology. Clear, unmistakable, intentional geometry, rectangular chambers, aligned passages, constructed layers extending deep underground, structures that could not possibly be natural because nature does not create right angles, does not organize chambers in grid patterns, does not align underground features to cardinal directions with precision. The team expanded their survey area, thinking perhaps they had found a localized anomaly, some small burial chamber or ceremonial space carved into the hillside in more recent centuries. But the more they scanned, the larger the structure became. The rectangular chambers were not isolated. They formed networks, connected by passages, arranged in levels, extending not just 10 or 20 feet below the surface but 40, 60, 80 feet down, far deeper than any simple megalithic monument should reach, far more extensive than any burial complex or temple should extend. This was not a shrine. This was not a tomb. This was architecture on a massive scale, buried completely beneath what everyone had assumed was a natural hill. Dr. Danny Hilman knew immediately what this meant. If the underground structures were real, if they were truly constructed by humans rather than created by some unknown geological process, then Gunung Padang was not a minor archaeological footnote. It was a major discovery, a site that had somehow escaped recognition for over a century despite being in plain sight, climbed by thousands of pilgrims, visited by multiple archaeological surveys, and dismissed by every expert who had looked at it. The question became, when was this built? How old were these underground structures? Because if they were recent, a few hundred or even a few thousand years old, the discovery would be interesting but not revolutionary. Indonesia had sophisticated cultures in the past few millennia, megalithic traditions, temple building, organized societies. Finding another ancient temple complex would add to knowledge but not fundamentally challenge it. But the geophysical data suggested something else, something that made Dr. Danny Hilman hesitate to speak publicly until he had more evidence. Because the deepest structures, the lowest chambers revealed by the scans, sat at depths that suggested incredible age. When structures are buried naturally, soil accumulates slowly, a few inches per century in stable environments, more in areas with heavy vegetation and erosion. But thick accumulation takes time, enormous amounts of time. The deepest chambers at Gunung Padang lay beneath nearly 100 feet of earth and constructed layers. If those chambers had been built on the surface and then naturally buried by soil accumulation alone, the time required would be measured not in centuries but in millennia. Many millennia. Dr. Danny Hillman knew he needed dating evidence. Ground-penetrating radar could reveal structure but could not reveal age. He needed to extract physical samples from the underground layers, needed to find organic material, charcoal from ancient fires, wood fragments, plant remains, anything that could be radiocarbon dated. Needed to drill core samples through the layers and bring up physical evidence that could be analyzed in laboratories. The team submitted proposals for core drilling, applied for permits, requested funding, and encountered the first wave of resistance that would characterize the entire project, because some members of the Indonesian archaeological community objected immediately. Not to the geophysical findings, which they acknowledged showed interesting patterns, but to the implications. Dr. Danny Hillman was a geologist, not an archaeologist. He was operating outside the traditional disciplinary boundaries. And more troubling, he was suggesting that Gunung Padang might be far older than any known Indonesian site, older than the Hindu-Buddhist temples, older than the megalithic traditions, potentially older than the Neolithic period. These implications made senior archaeologists uncomfortable. They preferred incremental discoveries that added detail to established timelines. They distrusted paradigm-threatening claims, especially from researchers outside the archaeological mainstream. Nevertheless, Dr. Danny Hillman persisted. He secured limited funding and permission for a modest drilling program. Between 2011 and 2015, his team extracted dozens of core samples from different locations across the site and from different depths. The cores revealed exactly what the geophysical surveys had suggested: constructed layers, stone structures intentionally built, used, and then buried or naturally covered over time. And between the stone layers, soil accumulation layers containing organic material, charcoal fragments, bits of wood, plant remains trapped when the layers were active before they were buried. Perfect material for radiocarbon dating. The samples were sent to laboratories, multiple independent labs, to ensure results could be cross-checked. Standard radiocarbon dating protocols followed, contamination controls implemented, everything done according to rigorous scientific methodology. And when the results came back, Danny Hillman understood why the archaeological establishment had been so resistant. Because the numbers were impossible. Not impossible in the sense of being wrong. The labs had checked and rechecked. Multiple samples from the same depths gave consistent results. The radiocarbon dating was solid. Impossible in the sense of being incompatible with everything archaeology taught about when humans developed the capability to build monumental structures. The surface layers, the megalithic stone arrangements visible to visitors, dated to approximately 2000 BC to 500 BC, relatively recent, within expected parameters for Indonesian megalithic traditions. No controversy there, but beneath the surface layers the dates became progressively older with depth. The second constructed layer, 10 to 30 feet down, dated to between 7000 and 9000 BC. Already surprising, that would place construction in the early Neolithic period, before pottery, before agriculture was supposed to be well established in Southeast Asia, but not impossible. Early Neolithic peoples built structures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dated to 9600 BC. Precedent existed for earlier architecture than previously thought. But the third constructed layer, 30 to 50 feet down, returned dates between 12,000 and 20,000 BC, deep into the late Paleolithic, the end of the last ice age, a time when humans were supposed to be mobile hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following game animals, sheltering in caves or temporary camps, not building massive stone structures with underground chambers and precise geometric layouts. And still the cores went deeper, still the layers continued. The fourth layer, the deepest constructed level that the team could reach with their drilling equipment, 50 to 100 feet beneath the current surface, buried under soil, under 3 earlier construction phases, under thousands of years of accumulated earth. This layer returned radiocarbon dates that made Dr. Danny Hillman question whether the labs had made a mistake. Dates clustering between 20,000 and 27,000 years before present. Some samples suggesting ages as old as 28,000 BC. Numbers so incompatible with the known timeline of human civilization that publishing them would invite immediate dismissal as contamination, as methodology errors, as anything other than what they appeared to be. Evidence that humans had built a massive pyramid-like structure in Indonesia 27,000 years ago. Dr. Danny Hillman sent more samples to different labs using different dating methodologies. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which dates minerals rather than organic material by measuring when they were last exposed to sunlight. This method provided independent verification. The OSL dates from the deepest layers aligned with the radiocarbon dates, between 20,000 and 27,000 years old. He commissioned uranium, thorium dating of flowstones that had formed in some of the underground chambers. This method dates the calcium carbonate deposits that form when water drips through limestone. The flowstone dates also supported the ancient chronology. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The deepest layers of Gunung Padang were built during the last ice age by people who were not supposed to possess the knowledge, organization, or motivation to construct monumental architecture. For several years, Dr. Danny Hillman and his team worked quietly, accumulating data, refining their surveys, extracting more samples, trying to build a case so comprehensive that it could not be easily dismissed when they finally went public. They documented everything. Photographed the core samples, preserved the organic material, recorded the exact depths and contexts, created three-dimensional models of the underground structure based on geophysical data, prepared detailed reports with full methodology, raw data, and conservative interpretations. They knew the claims would be controversial, knew the archaeological establishment would resist, knew they needed evidence that could withstand intense scrutiny. And in October 2023, they published the journal Archaeological Prospection, a peer-reviewed scientific publication respected in the field, accepted their paper. The title was deliberately technical, almost understated. Geoarchaeological Prospecting of Gunung Padang, Buried Prehistoric Pyramid in West Java, Indonesia. But the content was revolutionary. Decade of research, multiple dating methodologies, extensive geophysical surveys, all pointing to the same conclusion. Gunung Padang was not a natural hill, it was a constructed pyramid, and the oldest construction phases 16,000 BC, possibly as early as 27,000 BC, making it the oldest known pyramid on Earth, by a margin of over 20,000 years. The response was immediate and fierce. The Indonesian Archaeological Society issued a statement within days rejecting the findings. International archaeologists criticized the methodology, the interpretation, the very premise of the research, not because the data was flawed. The paper presented the data transparently. Anyone could review the methodology, examine the core sample results, see the geophysical scans. The criticism was based on implications. Because if Gunung Padang was truly 27,000 years old, or even 16,000 years old using the most conservative estimate, then everything taught about the development of human civilization was wrong. The timeline was compressed. The capabilities of Ice Age humans were underestimated. The narrative of linear progress from primitive to advanced was incomplete at best, fundamentally mistaken at worst. And so the discovery that should have been celebrated as the find of the century became instead a battleground. Scientists defending evidence against scientists defending paradigm, data against doctrine. The possibility that we are not the first sophisticated civilization on Earth against the comfortable belief that we are unique, that we are special, that nothing before us approached our achievement. The battle continues. The site remains mostly unexcavated. The Indonesian government, caught between scientific controversy and political pressure, has restricted further investigation pending additional review. Review that may never come, permission that may never be granted. Meanwhile, beneath a hillside in West Java, beneath the soil and vegetation, beneath the terraces where pilgrims still climb seeking enlightenment, the oldest pyramid on Earth waits. Stone chambers sealed for 27,000 years, passages that have known no footsteps since the last ice age, evidence that could rewrite human history. If anyone is allowed to excavate it, if the truth is permitted to emerge, if we are brave enough to accept what the stones have been trying to tell us for longer than civilization, as we know it, has existed. This is the story of that pyramid, the discovery that proves civilization is not 5,000 years old, not even 10,000 years old, but potentially 27,000 years old. The structure that challenges everything. The site that mainstream archaeology wishes would disappear. The evidence that will not stay buried. Not anymore. Not after 27,000 years of patience. Not when the technology finally exists to reveal what has always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when we were ready to look, to see, to understand, that we are not the beginning, only the continuation, and that the story of human civilization is far longer, far stranger, and far more fragile than we have ever been willing to believe. When Dr. Danny Hillman Nataraja first saw the ground penetrating radar images appear on his computer screen in 2010, he did what any good scientist does when confronted with impossible data. He assumed the equipment was malfunctioning. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the Earth and measuring how those pulses bounce back. Different materials reflect the pulses differently. Soil creates one signature, solid rock creates another. Air cavities create a third. The technology is reliable, proven, used by archaeologists and geologists worldwide to map underground features without the expense and disruption of excavation. But the technology is only as good as its interpretation, and what appeared on Dr. Danny Hillman's screen seemed too organized, too geometric, too deliberately structured to be real. The radar showed rectangular chambers, not one or two, but dozens, arranged in what appeared to be a grid pattern extending deep beneath the hillside. The chambers measured approximately 10 feet by 15 feet, with ceiling heights around 8 feet, based on the density signatures. They were connected by passages, narrow corridors that linked the chambers in networks. And every chamber, every passage, every structural element that the radar could detect, was aligned. North-south corridors ran parallel to each other. East-west passages intersected them at right angles. The entire underground complex appeared to be oriented to the cardinal directions with precision that would require sophisticated surveying techniques to achieve. Dr. Danny Hillman ran the survey again. Same results. He moved the equipment to a different location on the hillside. Same geometric patterns appeared. He brought in a second radar unit. Different manufacturer, different frequency range. It showed the same structures. Whatever lay beneath Gunung Padang, it was not a natural geological formation. Nature does not create right angles, does not organize cavities in grid patterns, does not align features to compass directions. What the radar was showing could only be one thing: human construction, deliberate architecture. A built environment that extended far deeper underground than anyone had suspected when they looked at the terraced hillside and saw only a natural formation with some surface stones. But ground-penetrating radar has limitations. It can reveal the presence of structures, show their approximate shapes and locations, but it cannot provide precise details about construction methods or materials. For that, Dr. Danny Hillman needed seismic tomography. This technology works differently than radar. Instead of electromagnetic pulses, it uses sound waves. Small controlled explosions or mechanical vibrations send seismic waves into the ground. Sensors placed at various locations measure how long those waves take to travel through the earth, and how they bend or reflect when they encounter different materials. Dense materials like solid rock transmit seismic waves quickly. Loose soil transmits them slowly. Air cavities create distinct disruptions in the wave patterns. The seismic surveys took weeks to complete. The team placed sensors across the entire hillside, creating a grid that would allow them to build a three-dimensional model of everything beneath the surface. They generated seismic waves from multiple points, recording thousands of data points, measuring wave speeds and reflections from every angle. And when the data was processed, when the computer algorithms translated the raw numbers into visual models, the team saw something that made the initial radar findings seem modest by comparison. The structure did not just extend 40 or 50 feet underground as the first radar scans had suggested. It went deeper, much deeper. The seismic data showed constructed features at 60 feet, 80 feet, even approaching 100 feet below the current surface. And the construction was not uniform. It appeared to be layered. Distinct levels of structural activity, separated by what looked like natural soil accumulation, as if the site had been built in phases. Constructed, used for some period, then abandoned or buried, then built upon again centuries or millennia later. The pattern repeated at least 4 times, going down through the depths. The uppermost constructed layer, the one corresponding to the visible megalithic stones on the surface, showed relatively simple construction. Columns of basalt arranged vertically, creating terraced platforms. This was the layer that previous archaeologists had documented, the layer they assumed represented the entirety of human activity at the site. But beneath this surface layer, the seismic data revealed something more sophisticated. A second layer of construction beginning about 10 feet down and extending to 30 feet depth. This layer showed not just vertical columns but horizontal elements, stone structures creating enclosed spaces, chambers with walls and what appeared to be ceiling supports. This was not simple megalithic arrangement. This was architecture, spaces designed to be entered, to be used, to serve some function. Deeper still, a third constructed layer appeared in the seismic scans, 30 to 50 feet below surface. And here the construction became massive. The seismic waves revealed very high-density materials, solid stone structures with walls several feet thick, larger chambers than the level above, more extensive networks of passages, and what looked like columns or pillars, vertical support structures that suggested these underground spaces had been designed to bear significant weight, to remain stable over long periods, to resist the immense pressure of earth and stone above them. At the deepest level that the seismic surveys could clearly resolve, 50 to 100 feet down, the data became harder to interpret because of the depth and the complexity of overlying materials. But even here, density signatures suggested constructed elements, regular patterns that did not match natural geology, alignments that implied intentional placement. And throughout all the layers, from surface to deepest detectable level, one feature remained constant: the alignment to cardinal directions. Every constructed element, every chamber, every passage that could be measured showed orientation to north, south, east, and west. This was not accidental, this was planned. Someone had surveyed this site with care, had established precise directional axes, and had maintained those alignments through multiple construction phases spanning what appeared to be vast stretches of time. But seismic tomography, like ground-penetrating radar, has its limits. It can show that something is there, can reveal size and density and arrangement, but it cannot tell you what you are looking at with absolute certainty, cannot distinguish between different types of stone with perfect accuracy, cannot reveal fine details of construction technique or purpose. For those answers, Dr. Danny Hillman needed physical samples, needed to drill into the structure and bring up actual pieces of the construction, needed material that could be analyzed, dated, and studied in laboratories under controlled conditions. The drilling program began in 2011. The team used hollow core drilling equipment, the kind that extracts a cylindrical sample of everything the drill passes through. As the drill descends, it cuts through soil, stone, whatever materials exist at each depth, preserving them in the order they were encountered. When the drill is pulled back up, it brings a core sample, a vertical slice through the stratigraphy, showing every layer from surface to the deepest point reached. These cores are like time machines. The deeper you go, the older the material. Each layer represents a different period in the site's history. And by carefully analyzing the cores, by identifying what materials appear at which depths, by dating organic material trapped within the layers, you can reconstruct a timeline of how the site developed over thousands of years. The first cores came from relatively shallow depths, 10 to 20 feet down. The team wanted to start with areas where the geophysical surveys had shown clear structural signatures, but where the depth was manageable with their equipment. And immediately, even in these first cores, they found confirmation of what the radar and seismic data had suggested. The cores showed constructed layers, not natural soil deposition, but intentional human activity. At around 15 feet depth, the drill penetrated a layer of columnar basalt. The cores brought up fragments of the hexagonal basalt columns, broken pieces showing the characteristic shape and texture of volcanic columnar jointing. But these were not random fragments scattered by natural processes. They were organized. The cores showed columns placed vertically, then a layer of soil and clay, then more columns arranged horizontally, creating a structured matrix. Between the stone layers, the cores revealed organic material, charcoal fragments probably from fires, bits of wood, possibly from construction supports or tools, plant remains, seeds and pollen trapped in the soil. All of this material was perfect for radiocarbon dating. The team carefully extracted the organic samples, documenting exactly which depth they came from, photographing them in context, preserving them in sealed containers to prevent contamination. These samples would be sent to radiocarbon dating laboratories, where sophisticated analysis could determine how long ago the organic material stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere, providing a date for when the plants or wood died, when the charcoal was created, when the layer containing them was active. But the team did not stop at 20 feet. They pushed deeper, 40 feet, 50 feet. Each time the drill descended further, the cores revealed more constructed layers, more columnar basalt, but arranged in increasingly sophisticated patterns at the deeper levels. More soil layers between the stone, suggesting long periods of abandonment or burial between construction phases, and more organic material offering more opportunities for dating. The pattern that emerged from studying dozens of cores extracted from different locations across the site was unmistakable. Gunung Padang was not a single-period construction. It was a multi-phase site, built, abandoned, buried naturally or intentionally, then rediscovered and built upon again. The cycle had repeated at least 4 times, and each phase appeared to be separated from the previous by centuries or millennia, based on the thickness of soil accumulation between the constructed levels. At 60 feet depth, the cores showed something that made the team pause. A layer of soil and clay much thicker than the accumulation between earlier levels. Nearly 10 feet of natural deposition before the next constructed layer appeared. 10 feet of soil accumulation takes enormous amounts of time to develop naturally. In stable environments with moderate vegetation, soil might accumulate at a rate of 1 inch every few decades, sometimes slower. 10 feet would represent many thousands of years, which meant the constructed layer beneath this thick soil deposit was dramatically older than anything above it, separated not by centuries but by millennia from the layers closer to the surface. The team drilled through the thick soil layer, and at 70 feet depth, the cores struck stone again, more columnar basalt. But the construction style was different from the upper layers. The columns were larger, more massive. Some fragments brought up by the cores measured over a foot in diameter, far larger than the 6 to 8 inch columns common in the upper levels. And the arrangement was more complex. The cores showed evidence of interlocking patterns, columns placed at angles to create corbelled structures, sophisticated weight distribution techniques that required advanced understanding of structural engineering. Between these massive stone elements, the cores revealed clay and soil layers with organic material trapped within. The team extracted the samples with extreme care. This deep contamination from more recent material infiltrating down through the soil becomes a serious concern. They documented the exact context of each sample, photographed the cores before extraction, sealed the organic material immediately, and sent multiple samples to multiple independent laboratories, ensuring that results could be cross-checked and verified. Because they suspected, based on the depth and the thick soil accumulation above this level, that the dates were going to be old. Far older than the few thousand years represented by the surface megalithic stones, perhaps as old as 10,000 BC, comparable to Göbekli Tepe. That would be revolutionary enough. That would push Indonesian monumental architecture back to the early Neolithic, thousands of years before it was supposed to exist in this region. But the team continued drilling. 90 feet. Approaching the limits of their equipment's capability, the cores became more difficult to extract as the drill penetrated deeper. The stone layers became denser, harder, the soil between them more compacted under the weight of everything above. But still the drill descended. Still the cores came up showing constructed elements, and at 90 to 100 feet depth, the deepest samples the team could reach, the cores showed the most massive construction of all. Basalt columns nearly 2 feet in diameter, walls constructed with precisely fitted stones, evidence of chambers with corbelled ceilings, architectural techniques that required not just brute force labor, but genuine engineering knowledge, understanding of how forces distribute through stone structures, how to create stable enclosed spaces that could support immense weight. And throughout these deepest layers, organic material appeared, trapped in the clay used as mortar between stones, preserved in soil layers that had been sealed by the construction above them, charcoal from fires, wood fragments, some showing evidence of having been worked with tools, cut or shaped before being incorporated into the construction. The team extracted every piece of organic material they could find, sent samples from the deepest levels to the most reputable radiocarbon dating laboratories they could access. Laboratories in Indonesia, Singapore, the United States. Multiple samples to each lab to allow for verification. And then they waited for the results that would determine whether Gunung Padang was an interesting archaeological site, or the most important discovery in the history of archaeology. The first dates came back from samples in the upper levels. The surface megalithic stones, as expected, dated between 2000 BC and 500 BC, late Neolithic to early historic period, consistent with known Indonesian megalithic traditions. No controversy there. The second constructed layer, 10 to 30 feet deep, returned dates between 7000 and 9000 BC, early Neolithic, earlier than expected for sophisticated construction in Southeast Asia but not impossible. Comparable to other early Neolithic sites being discovered worldwide. The archaeological community would debate the implications, but the dates were within the realm of possibility. Then came the dates from the third layer, 30 to 50 feet depth. The radiocarbon labs returned numbers that made Dr. Danny Hillman recheck the sample documentation, wondering if there had been a mix-up, if samples from different depths had been mislabeled. The dates clustered between 12,000 and 20,000 BC, deep in the late Paleolithic, the tail end of the last ice age, a time when humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile groups, following herds of ice age megafauna, sheltering in caves or temporary camps made of branches and animals' skins, not building massive stone structures with underground chambers and sophisticated engineering. Danny Hillman sent more samples from this level to different labs, same results, the dates held, between 12,000 and 20,000 years before present, and finally, the dates from the deepest level, 90 to 100 feet below the current surface. Multiple samples from multiple core locations, sent to multiple laboratories using multiple preparation techniques to rule out any possibility of systematic contamination. The labs took their time with these samples, ran them multiple times, verified their equipment calibration, because the dates they were getting seemed impossible. The numbers clustered between 20,000 and 27,000 years before present. Some individual samples suggested ages as old as 28,000 BC. If these dates were accurate, if the organic material truly dated to this period, then the construction layer it was trapped within also dated to this period, which would mean humans built a massive pyramid-like structure in Indonesia 27,000 years ago. Danny Hillman was a scientist. He understood the importance of verification. He knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. He requested additional dating using different methodologies. Optically stimulated luminescence dating was performed on quartz grains from soil layers adjacent to the construction. OSL dates when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight, providing an independent check on the radiocarbon results. The OSL dates from the deepest layers came back between 20,000 and 25,000 years old, consistent with the radiocarbon dates. Not identical. OSL and radiocarbon measure different things and have different uncertainties, but overlapping within error ranges. Uranium-thorium dating was attempted on calcium carbonate flowstones that had formed in some of the underground chambers where water had seeped through and deposited minerals over time. These flowstones formed after the chambers were constructed, as water dripped through cracks and slowly built up deposits. So the flowstone dates provided a minimum age. If a flowstone was 15,000 years old, the chamber it formed in must be at least that old, probably older. The uranium-thorium dates from flowstones in the deepest accessible chambers returned ages between 18,000 and 24,000 years. Again, consistent with the radiocarbon and OSL results. Again, pointing to the same impossible conclusion. 3 independent dating methods, multiple samples, multiple laboratories, all converging on the same time frame. The deepest constructed layers at Gunung Padang dated to between 20,000 and 27,000 years before present. If this was contamination, it would have to be systematic contamination affecting every sample, every method, every laboratory. That seemed far less likely than the alternative. That the dates were real, that the construction was truly this old. That some organized society with knowledge of engineering and architecture had built this structure in Indonesia during the last ice age, thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery, before anything that archaeology recognized as civilization. Dr. Danny Hillman examined the core samples again, looked at the construction techniques preserved in the fragments of stone and clay. The columnar basalt had been quarried from somewhere. Basalt forms in hexagonal columns when lava cools, but those columns remain embedded in the original lava flow. They do not transport themselves. Someone had to identify a basalt source, probably a nearby ancient lava flow or cliff face where the columns were naturally exposed. Someone had to extract the columns, possibly by driving wooden wedges into cracks and expanding them until the stone split free. Someone had to transport these columns, some weighing hundreds of pounds, from the quarry to the construction site. That required organization, labor coordination, perhaps simple machines like levers and rollers, knowledge of how to move heavy stones without breaking them. And once the stones arrived at the site, someone had to place them with precision. The cores showed that the columns were not randomly piled. They were arranged in specific patterns, vertical columns creating walls, horizontal columns forming ceilings and floors, stones fitted together with clay or soil as mortar, creating sealed chambers that could exclude water and support the weight of overlying materials. This was not crude experimentation. This showed planning, understanding of structural principles, experience with stone construction techniques, the kind of knowledge that develops over generations of practice, refined through trial and error, passed down from master builders to apprentices. The deepest layers showed the most sophisticated construction, the largest stones, the most complex arrangements, the most carefully engineered chambers, which suggested something troubling. The builders were not learning as they went. They were not starting with crude efforts and gradually improving. The oldest work was the most advanced, as if whoever built the deepest levels possessed knowledge and skills that the later builders, the ones who constructed the upper levels thousands of years later, could not fully replicate. As if knowledge had been lost and then partially recovered, each successive reconstruction phase representing an attempt to rebuild what ancestors had created but descendants no longer fully understood. Dr. Danny Hillman looked at his data, looked at the dating results, looked at the 3-dimensional models of the underground structure, looked at the photographs of core samples showing sophisticated construction from 27,000 years ago. And he knew that publishing this would destroy his reputation in mainstream archaeology, that he would be called a pseudoscientist, a sensationalist, someone making extraordinary claims based on flawed methodology, that his career would suffer, that funding would dry up, that colleagues would distance themselves. But he also knew that the evidence was solid, that the methodology was sound, that the data demanded publication, regardless of the professional consequences. Because if Gunung Padang was truly 27,000 years old, then everything changed. The timeline of human civilization was not compressed into the last 5,000 years, it extended back tens of thousands of years. Humans were capable of sophisticated organization and engineering far earlier than anyone had believed possible. And some catastrophic event or series of events, had destroyed or disrupted this early civilization, forcing humanity to rebuild from fragments, to slowly recover knowledge that had been lost when the old world fell. This was not just an interesting archaeological discovery. This was evidence of a forgotten chapter in human history, a chapter that we were only now beginning to recover. A story written in stone and buried beneath an Indonesian hillside for 27,000 years, waiting for the moment when technology advanced enough to read what the stones had been silently saying all along: that we are not the first, only the latest, and that the story of human achievement is far longer, far stranger, and far more tragic than we have ever imagined. In October 2023, the journal Archaeological Prospection published a paper that would ignite one of the most heated controversies in modern archaeology. The title was deliberately technical, almost bland in its academic formality: Geo-Archaeological Prospecting of Gunung Padang Buried Prehistoric Pyramid in West Java, Indonesia. But anyone who read past the abstract understood immediately that this was not a routine publication. This was a direct challenge to the fundamental timeline of human civilization, a challenge backed by a decade of research, hundreds of data points, multiple independent dating methodologies, and geophysical surveys that revealed structures so ancient they should not exist according to everything archaeology had established about when and how monumental architecture developed. The lead author was Dr. Danny Hillman Nattowijaja, the geologist who had spent 13 years investigating a site that previous archaeologists had dismissed as insignificant. His co-authors included geophysicists, geologists, and archaeologists from Indonesian institutions and international collaborators. The paper was peer-reviewed, meaning that independent experts had examined the methodology, checked the data, and found the research sound enough to warrant publication. Archaeological Prospection was not a fringe journal, it was a respected publication in the field, known for rigorous standards and careful editorial oversight. The fact that this paper made it through peer review meant that the editors and reviewers, however skeptical they might have been about the implications, could not find fatal flaws in the methodology or data presentation. The paper laid out the evidence systematically. Ground penetrating radar surveys showing rectangular chambers and aligned passages extending up to 100 feet below the surface. Seismic tomography revealing multiple constructed layers separated by natural soil accumulation. Electrical resistivity imaging confirming the presence of organized stone structures arranged in geometric patterns. And most importantly, the dating evidence. Radiocarbon results from dozens of organic samples extracted from carefully documented stratigraphic contexts at various depths throughout the structure. Optically stimulated luminescence dates from mineral grains providing independent verification. Uranium-thorium dates from flowstones establishing minimum ages for the chambers they had formed within. All the data was presented transparently. Raw numbers, not just interpreted conclusions. Photographs of core samples. Stratigraphic diagrams showing exactly where each dated sample came from. Error ranges and confidence intervals for every date. The methodology section was exhaustive, detailing every step of the sampling process, every laboratory protocol, every calibration procedure. Any researcher who wanted to challenge the findings had access to all the information needed to identify where the errors might have occurred. If contamination had affected the samples, the paper provided enough detail that critics could pinpoint exactly how and when. If the dating methods had been misapplied, the protocols were documented thoroughly enough to reveal the mistakes. But the paper did not hide from the controversial implications. The discussion section acknowledged directly that the dates challenged conventional chronology. The deepest constructed layer, based on multiple converging lines of evidence, appeared to date to between 16,000 and 27,000 years before present. The authors presented both a conservative interpretation, using the youngest plausible dates and largest error margins, suggesting construction around 16 BC, and a more aggressive interpretation, taking the oldest consistent dates at face value, suggesting construction possibly as early as 27,000 BC. Either interpretation was revolutionary. Either timeline pushed monumental architecture back thousands of years before it was supposed to exist. But by presenting both possibilities and acknowledging the uncertainties, the authors demonstrated they were not sensationalizing. They were reporting what the data showed and letting other researchers evaluate the evidence for themselves. The response from the archaeological establishment was swift and overwhelmingly hostile. Within days of the paper's publication, the Indonesian Archaeological Society issued an official statement rejecting the findings. The statement did not engage in detail with the methodology or data. Instead, it questioned whether Dr. Danny Hillman, as a geologist rather than an archaeologist, had the expertise to properly interpret the site. It suggested that the geophysical surveys might be revealing natural geological features that only appeared to be artificial structures. It claimed that the radiocarbon dates could have been affected by contamination from more recent organic material infiltrating down through the soil profile. And it concluded by stating that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that the Gunung Padang paper, despite its data, did not meet that threshold. International archaeologists joined the criticism. Some pointed out that radiocarbon dating of samples from complex, multi-phase sites is notoriously difficult. Organic material can move through soil over time. Roots from modern plants can penetrate deep into the ground. Water percolating down can carry dissolved organic compounds from surface layers to deeper levels. All of these processes can contaminate samples, making them appear younger than the context they are found in, or in rare cases, if old organic material moves downward, making shallow contexts appear older. The critics argued that without direct excavation, without being able to see the stratigraphy in profile, without being able to verify that the dated samples truly came from sealed, undisturbed contexts, the dates were questionable. Others focused on the lack of artifacts. If humans built this structure 27,000 years ago, where were the tools? Where were the pottery fragments, the stone blades, the evidence of domestic activity that should surround any major construction project? Where were the burials, the trash pits, the everyday remains of the people who supposedly organized and executed this massive engineering effort? The core samples showed stone and soil, but they did not show the dense archaeological debris that typically accumulates around human settlements. This absence, critics argued, suggested the structure was natural rather than artificial, or at most much more recent than the dating suggested, with the old radiocarbon dates resulting from contamination rather than true age. Some archaeologists went further, questioning not just the specific findings but the entire premise of the research. They argued that hunter-gatherer societies of the late Paleolithic simply did not have the social organization, technological knowledge, or economic surplus required to construct monumental architecture. Building something on the scale of Gunung Padang would require feeding and coordinating thousands of workers over years or decades. It would require specialized knowledge of stoneworking, structural engineering, and surveying. It would require a hierarchical society with leaders who could command labor and resources. All of this, according to mainstream archaeological theory, developed only after the agricultural revolution, only after humans settled in permanent villages and began producing food surpluses that could support non-food producing specialists like architects and engineers. The fact that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey had already challenged this narrative by demonstrating monumental architecture at 9600 BC, before agriculture was fully established in the region, did not seem to moderate the criticism of Gunung Padang. Instead, many archaeologists treated Göbekli Tepe as a unique anomaly, an exceptional case that proved the rule rather than suggesting the rule itself was wrong. They argued that Göbekli Tepe represented a special cultural fluorescence in one region, enabled by unusually abundant wild food resources that allowed hunter-gatherers to live semi-sedentary lifestyles. But extrapolating from one site in Turkey to suggest that Ice Age hunter-gatherers globally might have been capable of monumental construction was, in their view, unjustified. And pushing the timeline back from 9600 BC to 27,000 BC was not just unjustified but absurd. Danny Hillman and his team responded to the criticism with additional data and methodological clarifications. They pointed out that the core samples had been extracted using protocols specifically designed to prevent contamination. The drilling equipment was cleaned between cores. The samples were taken from the center of the cores, not the outer edges where infiltration would be most likely. The organic material was not loose fragments in soil but material trapped within clay layers that had been sealed by stone construction above and below, making infiltration extremely unlikely. And the fact that multiple independent dating methods, radiocarbon, OSL and uranium, thorium, all converged on similar age ranges strongly suggested the dates were real rather than artifacts of contamination. As for the lack of artifacts, the team explained that core drilling is a limited sampling method. The cores extracted cylindrical samples only a few inches in diameter. The total volume of material actually examined was tiny compared to the overall size of the site. Finding artifacts in such small samples would require extraordinary luck. Full excavation would be necessary to recover the kind of dense archaeological debris that critics were looking for. But Indonesian authorities, responding to pressure from the archaeological establishment, had restricted permission for further invasive investigation. The team was allowed to conduct non-invasive geophysical surveys, but full excavation, the very thing that could provide definitive answers, was being blocked pending additional review. The team also challenged the assumption that late Paleolithic societies could not have possessed the organization and knowledge needed for monumental construction. They pointed to Göbekli Tepe as proof that this assumption was already known to be false. If hunter-gatherers at 9600 BC could build massive stone temples, why was it inconceivable that earlier societies could have done the same? The difference between 9600 BC and 27,000 BC was large, but it was a difference of degree rather than kind. Anatomically modern humans with the same brain capacity as contemporary people had existed in Southeast Asia for over 50,000 years. In all that time spread across hundreds of generations, was it really impossible that some societies might have developed sophisticated cultures that left limited archaeological traces because their settlements were later drowned by rising sea levels or destroyed by climate catastrophes? The scientific debate, such as it was, quickly became overshadowed by political and institutional conflicts. The Indonesian Archaeological Society, which had opposed the research from the beginning, lobbied the Indonesian government to formally disavow the findings. They argued that publishing claims about a 27,000-year-old pyramid without definitive proof damaged Indonesia's credibility in the international archaeological community. They suggested that the research was motivated by sensationalism and tourism promotion rather than genuine scientific inquiry, and they requested that the government halt all further research at Gunung Padang until an independent committee of archaeologists could review the site and the data. The government found itself in a difficult position. On one hand, the discovery had generated enormous international interest. If Gunung Padang truly was the oldest pyramid on Earth, it would be an incredible source of national pride and a potentially massive tourism draw. Indonesia could claim to be the birthplace of monumental architecture, the site where human civilization first achieved sophisticated engineering. The economic and cultural benefits would be substantial. But on the other hand, the controversy was real. Respected archaeologists, both Indonesian and international, were publicly stating that the research was flawed. If the government endorsed the findings and they were later definitively disproven, the embarrassment would be significant. If they invested resources in developing the site as a major archaeological destination and the claims collapsed, the financial losses would be considerable. After months of deliberation, the Indonesian government issued a cautious statement. They acknowledged the research but did not endorse the controversial dates. They praised Dr. Danny Hillman's use of modern technology to study the site, but noted that further investigation would be required before conclusions could be drawn about the age and nature of the structure. And most significantly, they announced that all excavation at Gunung Padang would be temporarily suspended pending the formation of an expert review committee that would assess the existing data and make recommendations about future research directions. The committee would include archaeologists, geologists, and other specialists. It would have access to all the data Dr. Danny Hillman had collected, and it would report its findings within an unspecified timeframe. That was in late 2023. As of now, the committee has not issued its report. Excavation remains suspended. Danny Hillman continues to advocate for full investigation, arguing that the only way to settle the controversy definitively is to excavate the underground chambers, to expose the construction in profile, to recover artifacts that would provide context and confirmation for the dating. But permission for such excavation has not been granted. The site remains mostly buried, the questions remain unanswered, and the scientific community remains divided between those who think the evidence is compelling enough to warrant serious consideration, and those who believe the entire claim is based on flawed interpretation of ambiguous data. What makes this controversy particularly frustrating for observers seeking objective truth is that it is not fundamentally a disagreement about data. The geophysical surveys are not in dispute. Critics may disagree about how to interpret the patterns, but they do not claim the scans are fabricated. The radiocarbon dates are not in dispute. Critics may argue about contamination, but they do not claim the laboratories made errors or that the numbers are invented. The disagreement is about implications, about what it means if a 27,000-year-old pyramid exists in Indonesia, about how accepting such a claim would require revising not just regional chronologies but global understanding of human cultural development, and about whether evidence that challenges fundamental paradigms should be held to higher standards of proof than evidence that confirms existing beliefs. This pattern is not unique to Gunung Padang. It repeats throughout the history of archaeology whenever discoveries challenge established timelines. When Göbekli Tepe was first dated to 9600 BC in the 1990s, many archaeologists dismissed the findings. They suggested the dates must be wrong, that the site must be more recent, that hunter-gatherers could not possibly have built such structures. Only after decades of additional excavation, hundreds more radiocarbon dates, and overwhelming accumulation of evidence did the mainstream reluctantly accept that Göbekli Tepe was genuinely as old as claimed. And even then, it was treated as an anomaly rather than as evidence that the entire Neolithic chronology needed revision. When geological studies in the 1990s suggested that the Sphinx showed water erosion patterns consistent with exposure to heavy rainfall that had not occurred in Egypt for thousands of years before the conventional dating of the monument, Egyptologists rejected the findings outright. They argued that the geologists did not understand the specific weathering patterns of Egyptian limestone, that the erosion could be explained by other processes, that the geological evidence must be wrong because the historical and archaeological evidence clearly showed the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC during the 4th dynasty. The fact that geologists who specialized in rock weathering disagreed did not matter. The paradigm required the Sphinx to be 400–500 years old, so any evidence suggesting greater age had to be flawed, regardless of the expertise of those presenting it. When underwater structures off the coast of Japan, India, and the Mediterranean were discovered showing what appeared to be artificial construction at depths that required sea levels hundreds of feet lower than present, meaning construction before the end of the Ice Age, archaeologists were quick to suggest the structures were natural geological formations. When some researchers argued they showed clear signs of human modification, the mainstream response was that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, and that underwater archaeology was too difficult and ambiguous to support such revolutionary conclusions. The fact that some of the structures showed right angles, parallel lines, and apparent staircases did not overcome the paradigm resistance. Natural processes could create such features, critics argued, and therefore that must be the explanation, because the alternative required accepting that sophisticated societies existed before the supposed beginning of civilization. The pattern is clear and consistent. Evidence that fits the established paradigm is accepted readily, with modest levels of proof. Evidence that challenges the paradigm is resisted fiercely, with demands for extraordinary levels of proof that are often impossible to achieve, because access to the sites is restricted, funding is denied, and permits for excavation are blocked by the very institutions that control archaeological research. This creates a self-reinforcing system where paradigm-threatening discoveries can be indefinitely delayed in a state of unresolved controversy, while paradigm-confirming discoveries move smoothly through the publication and acceptance process. Dr. Danny Hillman finds himself caught in exactly this system. He has data, he has published in a peer-reviewed journal, he has responded to methodological criticisms. He has proposed ways to definitively test his claims through further excavation and sampling. But the institutional gatekeepers have effectively frozen the research. The Indonesian government, pressured by the archaeological establishment, has suspended excavation. International funding agencies, deferring to the opinions of senior archaeologists who oppose the research, have declined to support further investigation. And academic journals, wary of the controversy, have become reluctant to publish follow-up studies, creating a situation where additional research is both blocked and deemed unnecessary since, they argue, the initial claims remain unproven. Meanwhile, Gunung Padang continues to sit beneath its covering of soil and vegetation. The underground chambers remain sealed. The passages remain unexplored. The artifacts that could provide definitive context remain buried, and the oldest pyramid on Earth, if that is what it truly is, waits in darkness for permission that may never come, permission to be excavated, permission to reveal its secrets, permission to tell the story that it has preserved in stone for 27,000 years. A story about people who built when they were not supposed to be capable of building, who organized when they were not supposed to be capable of organization, who achieved sophistication when they were supposed to be primitive, a story that threatens the comfortable narrative of human progress. A story that institutional archaeology would apparently prefer remain untold, not because the evidence is weak, but precisely because it might be strong. Strong enough to topple paradigms that have stood for over a century. Strong enough to require rewriting textbooks, revising timelines, and admitting that we know far less about human history than we have claimed. And that is a truth that some, it seems, would rather keep buried beneath an Indonesian hillside indefinitely than allow into the light of full investigation and honest acknowledgement. A 3/8/24 words. If we set aside the controversy for a moment, if we accept the geophysical data and the dating evidence at face value and ask what they reveal about the people who built Gunung Padang, the answers that emerge are profoundly unsettling to our conventional understanding of Ice Age humanity. Because the structure itself, the techniques used in its construction, the knowledge required to design and execute it, all point to capabilities that should not exist 27,000 years ago, according to everything archaeology has taught us about human cultural development. This was not crude experimentation. This was not primitive people stumbling towards civilization through trial and error. This was sophisticated engineering executed with precision and planning by people who understood principles that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years after their world ended. The columnar basalt that forms the primary building material of Gunung Padang is not easy to work with. Basalt is one of the hardest common rocks, formed when molten lava cools rapidly. When basalt cools in thick flows, It often fractures into hexagonal columns as internal stresses cause the rock to crack in geometric patterns. These columns can be several feet in diameter and many feet long, creating natural building blocks if you can extract them from the parent rock formation and transport them to a construction site. But extraction is not simple. Basalt resists cutting and shaping. Stone tools can work it, but slowly, with great effort. You can exploit natural fractures, driving wooden or stone wedges into cracks and expanding them until sections break free. But this requires identifying the right fractures, understanding how force will propagate through the stone, and having the patience to work the rock without shattering it into useless fragments. The builders of Gunung Padang clearly understood these challenges. The core samples and geophysical data show that they selected columnar basalt of consistent size and quality. The columns used in any given construction layer are remarkably uniform, suggesting the builders had established standards, specifications for what constituted acceptable building material. This implies more than casual quarrying. This implies systematic extraction with quality control. Someone was inspecting the columns, rejecting those with flaws or incorrect dimensions, and ensuring that only suitable material reached the construction site. That level of organization requires specialization. Quarry workers who knew how to extract basalt, inspectors who understood structural requirements, transportation teams who could move heavy stones without damage. And transportation would have been a significant challenge. The nearest major basalt formations to Gunung Padang are several miles away. Moving columns weighing hundreds or even thousands of pounds across that distance without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, would require considerable ingenuity. Wooden rollers could work, but they wear out quickly under heavy loads and uneven terrain. Sledges might be more practical, but they still require smooth paths or enormous expenditure of effort to drag across rough ground. The most likely solution would be teams of laborers using a combination of techniques: levers to lift stones onto sledges or rollers, ropes, probably made from plant fibers, to pull and guide the loads, temporary tracks or pathways cleared and perhaps reinforced to ease movement. Coordination between dozens or hundreds of people to move each stone, with timing and rhythm essential to prevent accidents. This level of logistical organization implies social complexity far beyond small egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. You need hierarchy. Someone has to plan the quarrying schedule, decide how many columns to extract, coordinate the transportation, allocate labor between different tasks. Someone has to feed the workers. Even if the society was primarily based on wild food resources, sustaining a large labor force at a construction site for extended periods requires reliable food supply. Hunting and gathering parties bringing in game and plant foods, food storage to buffer against shortages, distribution systems to ensure workers receive adequate nutrition. All of this requires organization, planning, and probably some form of leadership with authority to direct collective effort toward long-term goals rather than immediate survival needs. Once the basalt columns arrived at the construction site, the engineering challenges intensified. The geophysical data and core samples show that the columns were not randomly stacked. They were arranged in specific patterns. Vertical columns placed side by side to create walls. Horizontal columns laid across vertical ones to form ceilings. Intersecting columns creating load-bearing structures. And everything oriented with precision to cardinal directions. This kind of construction requires understanding several engineering principles that are not intuitively obvious and must be learned through experience or inherited from earlier building traditions. First, the builders had to understand load distribution. When you stack heavy stones, you must ensure that the weight is distributed evenly to prevent collapse. Uneven loading creates stress points where material can crack or shift. The builders of Gunung Padang clearly understood this. The arrangement of columns shown in the core samples demonstrates careful attention to balance. Columns placed in patterns that distribute weight across multiple support points rather than concentrating it in single locations. Larger, more massive columns used at lower levels where the load is greatest. Smaller columns acceptable higher up where less weight must be supported. This is not trial and error. This is applied knowledge of structural mechanics. Second, the builders had to understand how to create stable enclosed spaces. Building walls is relatively straightforward. You stack stones vertically and ensure they are balanced. But creating chambers with ceilings, spaces that people can enter and use, requires solving the problem of spanning horizontal distances without the ceiling collapsing. The core samples from Gunung Padang show that the builders used several techniques. In some locations, they appear to have used corbelled construction, placing stones in overlapping layers so each layer projects slightly inward until the gap is small enough to bridge with a single stone. This technique is used in ancient structures worldwide, from Mycenaean Greece to Maya temples. because it allows creation of vaulted spaces, using only stacked stones without true arches. But it requires understanding that each stone must overlap the one below by just the right amount, not so much that it tips and falls, not so little that it fails to reduce the gap. In other locations, the geophysical data suggests the builders may have used wooden beams as ceiling supports, placing columnar basalt horizontally across the beams to create roofs. This technique would explain some of the carbonized wood fragments found in the core samples. If wooden beams were incorporated into the construction and later decayed or burned, they would leave voids that would show up in seismic scans and leave organic residue that could be radiocarbon dated. Using wood as structural elements requires understanding the load, bearing capacity of different tree species, how to season or treat wood to improve durability, and how to secure the beams so they do not shift under the weight of stones placed on them. Again, not intuitive knowledge. Not something you figure out casually. Knowledge that must be learned, practiced, and transmitted across generations. Third, the builders had to solve the problem of water management. The geophysical surveys revealed what appear to be drainage channels carved into some of the stone structures. Indonesia is a tropical environment with heavy seasonal rainfall. Any underground structure will eventually accumulate water unless drainage is provided. The builders of Gunung Padang apparently understood this and incorporated solutions into their design. Channels to direct water flow away from chambers. Clay layers that act as water barriers preventing seepage from above. Gravel or porous soil layers that allow water to percolate through without eroding the structure. These are the same principles used in modern engineering to protect underground spaces from water damage. The fact that Ice Age builders in Indonesia implemented them suggests either independent discovery of these principles or inheritance from an even earlier building tradition. Fourth, and perhaps most striking, the builders achieved precise astronomical alignment. The structure is oriented to cardinal directions with accuracy that requires sophisticated surveying techniques. Determining true north without a magnetic compass is not simple. You can observe the sun's movement and find east and west by marking where it rises and sets on the equinoxes. You can observe the stars and identify celestial north by tracking the rotation of the night sky. But translating these observations into precise ground alignments requires instruments and methods. You need ways to measure angles accurately, ways to transfer celestial observations to terrestrial layouts, ways to verify alignment over large distances to ensure the entire structure maintains the same orientation. The fact that Gunung Padang shows this precision suggests the builders possessed astronomical knowledge. They were watching the sky systematically enough to understand solar and stellar movements. They were recording observations, probably over many years, to establish reliable reference points. And they considered this knowledge important enough to encode it in their architecture, to build according to celestial alignments rather than just functional convenience. This combination of astronomy and architecture appears in later civilizations. The Egyptian pyramids aligned to north with fractions of a degree accuracy. Stonehenge oriented to solstice sunrise. Maya temples positioned according to Venus cycles. But these civilizations are conventionally dated to the last few thousand years. Finding the same practices at 27,000 BC pushes the timeline of astronomical architecture back over 20,000 years. The construction occurred in multiple phases, with long periods of abandonment or burial between building episodes. The thick soil layers separating the constructed levels indicate that centuries or millennia passed between phases. This pattern raises profound questions. Why build, abandon, and rebuild in the same location across such vast time spans? Several possibilities emerge, each with troubling implications for our understanding of cultural continuity and catastrophic disruption. One possibility is that the site was built, then abandoned due to some local disaster. Perhaps an earthquake damaged the structure, making it unsafe or unsuitable for its original purpose. Perhaps a volcanic eruption covered it with ash. Perhaps climate changes made the region less habitable and the builders migrated elsewhere. Then, centuries or millennia later, a new population discovered the buried ruins and chose to build upon them, either because they recognized the site as sacred or simply because the leveled terraces provided good building platforms. This scenario implies no direct cultural connection between construction phases. Each building episode represents a different society, unrelated to the previous builders except by chance geography. But another possibility is more intriguing and more consistent with the pattern of similar construction techniques across all layers. Perhaps the site was intentionally buried for preservation, then rediscovered and rebuilt by cultural descendants of the original builders. This pattern appears at Göbekli Tepe, where the entire complex was deliberately filled with rubble around 8000 BC, buried carefully rather than abandoned carelessly. The reasons for such deliberate burial remain debated. but possibilities include ritual closure, protective preservation before anticipated catastrophe, or intentional concealment to safeguard sacred knowledge. If Gunung Padang was similarly buried intentionally, it suggests the builders anticipated something. Perhaps they saw environmental changes coming. Perhaps they experienced or remembered previous catastrophes and wanted to protect their greatest achievement. Perhaps they were encoding knowledge in stone, creating a structure that would survive when everything else was destroyed. If this interpretation is correct, then the later construction phases represent rediscovery, descendants or cultural successors finding the buried structure, recognizing its significance, and building new levels on top as an act of remembrance or restoration. The fact that each successive layer uses similar materials and techniques, columnar basalt arranged in geometric patterns, aligned to cardinal directions, suggests cultural continuity. These later builders were not randomly choosing to replicate the earlier work. They were following tradition, maintaining a building style that they associated with sacred or ancestral origins. This implies transmission of knowledge across the gaps. Oral traditions preserving memory of the buried structure. Stories about ancestors who built in certain ways according to certain principles. And each generation that rediscovered the site attempting to honor and continue what had been started thousands of years before. This scenario implies something remarkable about human cultural memory. If the deepest layers date to 27,000 BC and the upper layers to 2000 BC, the entire sequence spans 25,000 years. That is longer than the entire span of what we conventionally call civilization. Yet across that immense time, separated by periods of apparent abandonment, the building tradition persisted, not perfectly. The later builders perhaps did not fully understand what they were replicating. Perhaps they had lost the knowledge of why certain alignments mattered, or what the underground chambers were originally designed for, but they preserved enough of the tradition to continue building in the same style, using the same materials, maintaining the same orientations. That is cultural continuity on a timescale we have never documented before. It suggests that human societies can maintain core cultural knowledge across catastrophic disruptions, across dark ages lasting millennia, passing fragments forward through oral tradition until circumstances allow rebuilding. The construction techniques themselves tell another story. The oldest, deepest layers show the most sophisticated engineering, the largest stones, the most complex chamber designs, the most carefully executed corbelling and drainage. As the construction phases progress upward through time, becoming more recent, the scale becomes smaller and the techniques simpler. The upper layers still show skill and planning, but they lack the monumental ambition of the deepest levels. This pattern is the opposite of what we expect from cultural evolution. We expect simple to complex, crude early efforts improving over time as knowledge accumulates. But Gunung Padang shows complex becoming simpler, sophisticated degrading toward basic, as if knowledge was being lost rather than gained across the construction episodes. This pattern appears elsewhere when civilizations collapse. After the fall of Rome, European building techniques declined. The massive aqueducts and monumental architecture of the imperial period were not replicated by successor kingdoms. Medieval builders constructed impressive cathedrals, but they could not reproduce the concrete technology or engineering scale of Roman works. Knowledge was lost when the social systems that maintained it collapsed. Master builders died without fully training successors. Trade networks that supplied specialized materials disintegrated. The organizational capacity to coordinate massive labor forces disappeared. Later generations inherited ruins they could admire but could not fully reproduce. Gunung Padang may preserve evidence of a similar cycle occurring in deep prehistory. The oldest builders achieved something spectacular. They possessed knowledge and organizational capacity that created a monumental structure. Then something disrupted their society. War, climate change, natural disaster, epidemic, something that broke the transmission chains. The next generation preserved fragments of knowledge, but could not fully replicate the achievement. They rebuilt smaller, simpler. The tradition continued, but diminished. Each cycle of rebuilding represented an attempt to reach back toward what ancestors had accomplished, using whatever knowledge survived, but never quite matching the original sophistication. If this interpretation is correct, and the dating evidence certainly supports it, then Gunung Padang becomes evidence for something archaeology has long resisted acknowledging. The possibility that human cultural development is not linear, not a steady progression from primitive to advanced, but cyclical, rises and falls, achievements and collapses, knowledge gained and lost and partially recovered, civilizations emerging, flourishing, and disappearing, sometimes leaving traces that later societies build upon without fully understanding what they have inherited. This cyclical model explains many anomalies that the linear progression model struggles with. It explains why sophisticated techniques sometimes appear too early in the archaeological record, not because they were invented prematurely, but because they were being recovered from earlier cycles. It explains why some ancient structures show engineering knowledge that seems out of place for their era, not because aliens or lost super civilizations built them, but because the builders were working from fragmentary knowledge preserved from earlier, more sophisticated predecessors whose full achievements have been lost. It explains why myths worldwide preserve stories of golden ages, of ancestors who knew more, built better, achieved greater things before catastrophes reset human progress. Not because these are fantasies, but because they are compressed memories of real cycles, real rises and falls, transmitted orally across so many generations that the details blurred into mythology. Gunung Padang, if its dating is accepted, becomes the earliest clear evidence of this cyclical pattern. A structure showing multiple construction phases across 25,000 years, starting sophisticated and becoming simpler over time, built, buried, rediscovered, rebuilt. Each phase representing a different society, possibly connected by cultural tradition, possibly independent, but all drawn to the same location, all building with the same materials, all maintaining the same alignments. The structure preserves in stone what oral tradition would preserve in story. The memory of ancestors who built, the knowledge, however fragmentary, of how they built, the impulse to continue what they started, even when the reasons were half forgotten and the full techniques lost. And if one such structure exists, if one Ice Age society achieved this level of sophistication, then the question becomes unavoidable. How many others existed? How many societies developed complex cultures during the 100,000 years of the last Ice Age and left no trace because their settlements were on coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater? How many achievements were erased by the catastrophic climate changes that ended the Ice Age, by the Younger Dryas cold snap that reversed warming trends for over 1,000 years, by the massive floods that drowned continental shelves as glaciers melted? Gunung Padang survived because it was inland, elevated, in a location that escaped both glaciation and inundation. But what of coastal societies? What of populations living on the broad plains that surrounded Ice Age landmasses before the seas rose? They would have been the most prosperous, with access to marine resources, trade routes, temperate climates. And they would have been the first to drown when the ice melted and the world transformed. We assume Ice Age humans were primitive because we find so little evidence of sophistication. But perhaps we find little because we are looking in the wrong places. On land that was habitable during the Ice Age and remains above water today. Marginal territories, inland regions. Places that Ice Age peoples might have used but not preferred. While the best territories, the most productive environments, the locations where complex societies would most likely develop, are now beneath hundreds of feet of ocean on continental shelves that archaeologists can barely access and have hardly begun to explore systematically. Gunung Padang may be anomaly only in that it survived, not in its sophistication but in its location. One of the few Ice Age achievements elevated and inland enough to escape destruction. One of the few remnants of a lost world that the sea could not claim and time could not completely erase. That lost world, that Ice Age civilization that conventional archaeology insists could not have existed, whispers to us from beneath an Indonesian hillside, speaks in stone and geometry, tells us through radiocarbon dates and engineering precision that we have underestimated our ancestors, compressed their achievements into too brief a timeline, assumed too readily that we are the first to build, to plan, to organize, to create. Gunung Padang says otherwise. Says they were here, they built, they knew. And then their world changed, and what they knew was almost lost, almost but not entirely, because they left this, buried it, preserved it, passed on just enough tradition that later generations would rebuild in the same place, in the same way, maintaining a connection across thousands of years, maintaining a thread that reaches forward to us, to this moment, when we finally have the technology to see what they left, to date what they built, to understand, if we are willing to listen to what the stones are saying, that the human story is longer and stranger and more tragic than we have ever acknowledged. That we are not the first, that they came before, that they achieved much, that catastrophe took almost everything, and that we inherit their fragments, their whispers, their warnings buried in stone, waiting 27,000 years to be found, to be understood, to teach us what we have forgotten, that civilizations rise and civilizations fall, and the cycle perhaps is about to turn again. Our 3891 words Gunung Padang does not stand alone. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about this discovery. It is not an isolated anomaly that can be dismissed as a measurement error or a unique aberration. It is part of a pattern, a global pattern that has been emerging over the past few decades as new sites are discovered, as dating techniques improve, as underwater archaeology begins to explore the drowned continental shelves where Ice Age humans actually lived. Each new discovery adds weight to what Gunung Padang suggests, that human societies achieved sophistication far earlier than conventional chronology allows. That monumental architecture is thousands of years older than the textbooks claim, that the timeline of civilization needs to be expanded, not by decades or centuries, but by tens of thousands of years, and that we are rediscovering rather than discovering the capabilities of our Ice Age ancestors. The pattern began to emerge in 1994, long before anyone suspected what lay beneath the Indonesian hillside at Gunung Padang. In southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site that local shepherds had long avoided, calling it cursed or haunted. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill, a reference to its rounded appearance. Previous surveys had noted megalithic stones on the surface, but they were dismissed as medieval grave markers or recent constructions. No one imagined what lay beneath because what lay beneath should not have been possible. Schmidt's excavation revealed massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing 18 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. These pillars were arranged in circular formations, multiple circles containing dozens of pillars, creating what appeared to be temple complexes or ceremonial gathering spaces. The pillars were not crude monolith. They were carefully shaped with smooth surfaces and intricate carvings. Animals appeared in relief on the stone surfaces. Foxes, scorpions, snakes, bulls, wild boar, birds. Some pillars showed what appeared to be human hands carved along the sides, as if the pillars represented stylized human figures. And the most famous pillar, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, displayed what some researchers interpret as a star chart, constellations arranged in patterns that might record an astronomical event, possibly a comet impact. When the radiocarbon dates came back from organic material found in the fill surrounding the pillars, they returned numbers that shocked the archaeological community. 9600 BC, nearly 12,000 years ago, 6,000 years before the Sumerian civilization that was supposed to mark the beginning of complex society. 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, at a time when humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following animal migrations, sheltering in caves or temporary camps. Yet here stood temple complexes that required quarrying, transporting, and erecting stones weighing many tons. That required organizing hundreds or thousands of workers. That required planning, coordination, specialized knowledge of stoneworking and construction techniques. The mainstream archaeological response to Göbekli Tepe was initially dismissive. The dates must be wrong. The site must be more recent. Hunter-gatherers simply could not have built such structures. But as more excavations occurred, as more radiocarbon samples were processed, as the evidence accumulated beyond any possibility of error, the resistance began to crumble. Göbekli Tepe was eventually accepted as genuinely dating to 9600 BC. It became incorporated into the archaeological narrative, though not without considerable reframing to minimize its paradigm-threatening implications. It was described as a unique ritual center, an exceptional case enabled by unusually abundant wild resources in the region that allowed hunter-gatherers to live in semi-permanent settlements. An anomaly that proved the rule rather than suggesting the rule itself was wrong. But even as Göbekli Tepe was being grudgingly accepted, it remained an outlier. One site in one region, impressive but isolated, until other sites began appearing in the same region. Navoli Ori, another megalithic site in Turkey with T-shaped pillars and complex structures, dated to 8600 BC. Karantep discovered more recently showing similar architecture and dating to the same general period. Atayak, a Neolithic settlement dated to 7500 BC, housing perhaps 8,000 people in a dense urban layout that required sophisticated social organization and planning. Each new discovery pushed sophistication earlier. Each suggested that complex society in Anatolia was not a sudden development emerging around 3500 BC with the rise of cities in Mesopotamia, but a long tradition extending back to the end of the Ice Age and possibly beyond. Göbekli Tepe established a precedent. It proved that monumental architecture existed at 9600 BC, shattering the conventional timeline by 6,000 years. Gunung Padang, dated potentially to 27,000 BC, shatters the timeline by another 17,000 years. The jump from Sumer to Göbekli Tepe was revolutionary. The jump from Göbekli Tepe to Gunung Padang is civilizational paradigm destruction. But Göbekli Tepe makes Gunung Padang plausible. If sophisticated construction could exist at 9600 BC, why not earlier? If hunter-gatherers could organize to build temples at the end of the Ice Age, why assume they could not have done so during the Ice Age? The difference is one of degree, not kind. And the pattern suggests that what we are discovering is not the beginning of human capability, but fragments of a much longer tradition that extends back into periods we have barely begun to investigate. The second major piece of supporting evidence comes from an entirely different direction, from beneath the waves. Because while Göbekli Tepe and Gunung Padang survived on land, elevated enough to escape the flooding that followed the Ice Age, most Ice Age human settlements would not have been so fortunate. During the last Ice Age, global sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than today. The water that now fills the oceans was locked in massive ice sheets covering much of North America, Europe, and Asia. The coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. Broad continental shelves that are now underwater were dry land, and these coastal zones, with their access to both marine and terrestrial resources, their moderate climates, their navigable waterways, would have been the most desirable locations for human settlement. They would have been where populations concentrated, where trade developed, where complex societies would most likely emerge. Then the Ice Age ended, not gradually and peacefully, but in violent pulses. The Younger Dryas period brought 1,000 years of climate chaos starting around 10,800 BC, possibly triggered by cosmic impacts that destabilized the climate system. When warming finally resumed around 9600 BC, the ice sheets did not melt slowly, they collapsed catastrophically. Meltwater Pulse 1b sent torrents of glacial runoff into the oceans. Sea levels rose not inches per year but feet per year in some periods. Coastlines retreated inward at rates visible within a human lifetime. And every settlement, every structure, every achievement of Ice Age coastal civilizations was drowned beneath hundreds of feet of rising water. Today, marine archaeology is beginning to explore these drowned landscapes, and what they are finding suggests that Ice Age humans were not primitive cave dwellers but sophisticated coastal peoples who built structures, created settlements, and developed cultures that were erased when the seas rose. In the Gulf of Kammat, formerly the Gulf of Cambay, off the western coast of India, sonar surveys in the early 2000s revealed geometric structures on the seabed at depths of approximately 120 feet. The sonar images showed what appeared to be straight lines, right angles, rectangular formations that could be building foundations or city layouts. When the discovery was announced, skeptics immediately suggested natural geological formations. Sonar can be ambiguous. Shadows and reflections can create patterns that look artificial but are actually random. But then artifacts began to be recovered from the area. Pieces of worked wood, showing evidence of cutting and shaping with tools. Pottery fragments, stone objects that appeared to be modified rather than naturally formed. And when these artifacts were dated, they returned ages of approximately 9,500 years, placing them in the early Holocene period. Shortly after the end of the Ice Age, and well before conventional chronology would expect sophisticated settlements in this region. The Indian government initially supported the research, seeing potential for a discovery that would push back the origins of Indian civilization. But as controversy developed, as mainstream archaeologists questioned the findings, funding was reduced and full-scale excavation was never authorized. The structures remain on the seabed, unexplored, their nature unresolved. Another piece of potentially paradigm-threatening evidence that institutional archaeology has declined to fully investigate. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers discovered massive underwater structures showing what appear to be carved steps, straight edges, flat platforms, and right-angle corners. The formations are located at depths that would have been above water only during the last Ice Age, when sea levels were lower. The structures have been intensely debated. Some geologists argue they are entirely natural, formed by tectonic activity and erosion along natural bedding planes in the sandstone. Others point to features that seem too regular, too precisely shaped, to be purely natural. Steps that are uniformly spaced, corners that meet at exact right angles, surfaces that appear to have been flattened by tools. The controversy remains unresolved, but the possibility that humans modified natural formations or even created the structures entirely cannot be definitively ruled out. And if humans were responsible, the dating would place the work before the end of the Ice Age, before sea levels rose to submerge the site. In the Mediterranean, similar discoveries have emerged. Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel is a submerged Neolithic village that was inundated around 6000 BC when rising sea levels flooded the coastal settlement. The site is remarkably well preserved because it was buried rapidly by sand and sediment, protecting structures from erosion and decay. Archaeologists have found stone buildings, hearths, burial sites, and even a stone circle similar to megalithic monuments found on land. The village shows sophisticated community planning and organization. It was not a primitive camp, but a developed settlement with permanent structures and complex social activities. The fact that it was drowned demonstrates how sea level rise erased coastal settlements, preserving them underwater but making them invisible to traditional land-based archaeology. Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece is another submerged city, dated to approximately 5,000 years ago but possibly older. The entire town layout is visible on the seabed. Streets, buildings, courtyards arranged in organized patterns. It was a functioning urban settlement before it was drowned by either sea level rise or tectonic subsidence. And near Malta, underwater surveys have discovered structures on the seafloor that appear to predate the famous Maltese megalithic temples on land. If these underwater structures are confirmed as artificial, they would push back the megalithic tradition in Malta by thousands of years. The pattern across all these underwater discoveries is consistent. Coastal settlements existed. They were sophisticated enough to build with stone and organize in planned layouts. They were drowned by rising seas, and they now lie on continental shelves accessible only to marine archaeologists with specialized equipment, funding, and permits. Most of the world's continental shelves have never been systematically surveyed for archaeological remains. The few areas that have been explored have revealed tantalizing hints of lost settlements. If exploration were expanded, if resources were devoted to underwater archaeology at the scale devoted to land-based excavation, what might be found? How many drowned cities? How many submerged monuments? How many lost civilizations erased by the post-Ice Age floods? Gunung Padang, located inland and elevated, survived the floods that claimed coastal sites. But it cannot have been unique. If one inland society achieved monumental construction during the Ice Age, others likely did as well. And those others, if they were coastal or low-lying, are now underwater, beyond easy reach, archaeologically invisible unless and until systematic underwater exploration discovers them. This explains why the Ice Age seems archaeologically empty. Not because humans achieved little, but because we achieved much in the places that are now hardest to investigate. The drowned continental shelves, the submerged river valleys, the plains that became shallow seas when the ice melted. The third major piece of supporting evidence comes from geology, from ice cores and climate data that confirm exactly what the myths describe. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric records stretching back over 100,000 years. Each layer of compacted snow captures a snapshot of Earth's climate at the time it fell, temperature, precipitation, atmospheric composition, volcanic ash, cosmic dust, all locked in frozen chronological order. And what the ice cores show is that between 12,000 and 10,000 BC, Earth's climate underwent violent changes. Around 10,800 BC, temperatures that had been warming suddenly reversed. The Younger Dryas period began, bringing a return to near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. Average temperatures dropped by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The shift was not gradual. Ice core data suggests it occurred within decades, possibly within years. An entire generation saw their climate transform, and the cause remains debated, but growing evidence points to cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid fragmenting in the atmosphere and striking the Laurentide ice sheet that covered North America. The impacts would have triggered massive wildfires, thrown debris into the atmosphere blocking sunlight, and destabilized the climate system, bringing cold and chaos. Evidence for this impact includes a layer of sediment found at over 50 sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all dated to 10,800 BC. This layer contains unusual concentrations of platinum, iridium and other elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. It contains nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond particles that form only under the extreme pressures and temperatures of cosmic impacts. It contains spherules, tiny glass beads created when rock is melted and flung into the air by explosions, then cooled rapidly into spherical droplets. All of these markers point to catastrophic impact events, and the timing coincides exactly with mass extinctions. The Ice Age megafauna, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American camels, cave bears, all went extinct around 10,800 BC. Species that had survived multiple glacial cycles, that had endured hundreds of thousands of years of climate fluctuations, suddenly disappeared within a few centuries. The extinction pattern suggests rapid environmental collapse, not gradual climate change. And if the megafauna could not survive the Younger Dryas catastrophe, human societies would have been equally devastated. Populations would have crashed, settlements would have been abandoned, complex social organizations would have fragmented, knowledge would have been lost. Then, around 9600 BC, the cold reversed again. Temperatures surged back toward warmth, not gradually but rapidly, within decades, and the glaciers, weakened by over 1,000 years of stress from the Younger Dryas chaos, collapsed. Meltwater Pulse 1b sent catastrophic floods of glacial runoff into the oceans. Sea levels rose by dozens of feet within centuries, possibly faster during peak melting periods. Any coastal civilization, any society that had survived the Younger Dryas cold snap and was rebuilding on the newly exposed coastlines, would have been drowned in this second wave of catastrophe. The geological record confirms what every ancient culture describes in myth: a great catastrophe, a world-ending flood. A time when the old world was destroyed and survivors had to rebuild from fragments. The ice cores and sea level data provide independent verification that the climate catastrophes described in myths actually occurred. The floods were real. The cataclysms happened, and the world did end for Ice Age societies. And Gunung Padang, if its dating is accurate, provides evidence that sophisticated societies existed before these catastrophes, that they built monuments that survived, that their achievements were real, not mythological fantasies but actual engineering and organization. The geology supports the archaeology supports the myths, and all three point to the same conclusion: that Ice Age humanity was far more capable than we have believed, that civilizations rose during the Ice Age, that catastrophe destroyed most of them, and that only fragments survived, preserved in elevated locations like Gunung Padang or in oral traditions that became the flood myths of later cultures. The fourth piece of supporting evidence comes from the myths themselves, from the realization that what we have dismissed as primitive religious storytelling may actually be compressed historical memory. Every ancient culture preserves flood traditions. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim surviving a deluge sent by the gods. The Hebrew Bible recounts Noah and the Ark. Hindu texts tell of Manu warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu. Greek mythology remembers Deucalion and Pera surviving Zeus's flood. Chinese records describe Gun and Yu taming the great floods. Mayan traditions speak of worlds destroyed by water. Hopi legends preserve memories of previous worlds ending in catastrophe. These stories were long dismissed as independent inventions, the natural result of every culture experiencing local flooding and creating explanatory myth. But the details are too consistent, the sequence too similar. An advanced world exists. Divine or ancestral figures warn of coming catastrophe. A chosen survivor preserves knowledge. Floods destroy the old world. Humanity rebuilds from remnants. This is not a generic flood story. This is a civilization reset narrative. A story about societies that achieved sophistication and then lost almost everything, forcing descendants to start over with only fragmentary knowledge of what came before. The geological evidence confirms that global flooding occurred at the end of the Ice Age. Sea levels rose 400 feet. Coastlines drowned. The myths describe exactly this. Not local river floods but world-altering catastrophes that transformed landscapes and forced mass migrations. The myths are not inventing the floods, they are preserving memory of them. And if the flood memories are real, what about the rest? The advanced pre-flood worlds described in the myths, the cities and knowledge that were lost, the ancestors who built and knew things that later generations could not replicate. Perhaps these are memories too. Compressed and mythologized but based on real societies, real achievements, real knowledge that was lost when the waters rose. Gunung Padang provides physical evidence for what the myths describe. A structure from before the floods, built when the myths say advanced societies existed, using techniques that required knowledge and organization, then buried, abandoned, or both, preserved through the catastrophes that destroyed most Ice Age achievements. Rediscovered by later societies who built upon it, maintaining a tradition they no longer fully understood but recognized as sacred and ancient. The myths told us this pattern existed. Archaeology dismissed the myths as fantasy. Geology confirmed the catastrophes were real. And now Gunung Padang suggests the advanced pre-flood societies were real too. That the myths were right. That we are the descendants of survivors. That civilization is not 5,000 years old but much older. That we have been here before. That we have risen before, that we have fallen before, and that the long cycle of rise and catastrophe and rebuilding, is the true pattern of human history. A pattern that Gunung Padang has preserved in stone for 27,000 years, waiting for us to develop the technology to see it, waiting for us to develop the courage to accept it, waiting to teach us what we have forgotten, that we are not the first, that others came before, that they built, that they knew, and that catastrophe took almost everything. Almost, but not quite. Because they left this, and the stones after all these years are finally speaking, if only we are willing to listen. To understand why Gunung Padang threatens the archaeological establishment so profoundly, we must first understand what that establishment has built. What narrative has been constructed over the past 2 centuries through thousands of excavations, millions of artifacts, and countless scholarly publications. What story has been told and retold until it became not just consensus but dogma, not just theory but fact. A story so deeply embedded in educational systems, so thoroughly integrated into how we understand ourselves as a species, that challenging it feels like challenging gravity or denying the sun rises in the east. The story is simple, elegant, and comforting. Humans progressed from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex, from ignorance to knowledge, in a steady, linear march that began approximately 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and continues, with occasional setbacks, to the present day. The official timeline, the one taught in universities worldwide, the one that appears in textbooks and museum displays, goes something like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans lived as hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands, perhaps 20 to 50 individuals moving seasonally to follow game animals and harvest wild plants. They had fire. They had stone tools that became gradually more sophisticated over tens of thousands of years. They had language, art, symbolic thought, but they had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no domesticated animals except eventually the dog. No pottery because pottery is heavy and nomads cannot carry heavy objects. No writing because writing requires sedentary life and complex administration. This was the human condition for 95% of our existence as a species. Mobile, egalitarian, living in balance with nature, achieving cultural sophistication in art and ritual but limited materially by the constraints of constant movement. Then, around 10,000 BC, in a period called the Neolithic Revolution, everything changed. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, humans began experimenting with plant cultivation. They saved seeds from wild grasses, wheat and barley, and deliberately planted them. They began managing wild animal populations, protecting and breeding sheep, goats and cattle. This agricultural experimentation took thousands of years to develop. Slow trial and error, gradual understanding of seasons, soil, water management, but eventually around 8000 BC, agriculture became reliable enough to support permanent settlements. Villages appeared, Jericho in Palestine, Eretoik in Turkey, communities of hundreds or thousands of people living year-round in one location, sustained by cultivated crops and domesticated herds. Agriculture enabled population growth, permanent settlements enabled accumulation of possessions. Surplus food production enabled specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could become potters, making ceramic vessels to store grain. Some could become toolmakers, crafting better implements. Some could become priests or administrators, organizing community activities and mediating disputes. Social hierarchy emerged, leaders and followers, rich and poor. The egalitarian band structure of hunter-gatherers gave way to stratified societies with chiefs, kings, and ruling classes. And then around 3500 BC in southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built the first cities, Uruk, or Eridu, urban centers housing tens of thousands of people. They invented writing, cuneiform script pressed into clay tablets to record economic transactions and eventually literature, law, and history. They developed mathematics for trade and astronomy. They constructed monumental architecture, ziggurats reaching toward the sky. They created the wheel, the plow, the sailboat. They established the first known legal codes, the first schools, the first bureaucratic states. Sumer was the beginning, the template. Everything that came after, Egyptian pyramids, Indus Valley cities, Chinese dynasties, built on Sumerian innovations or developed similar systems independently. But Sumer was first. Civilization began there 500 years ago. Before that was prehistory. Before that was the long, slow climb from primitive to civilized. Before that was darkness. This is the narrative, clean, linear, progressive, humans learning, advancing, improving, from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age to the modern world. Each stage building on the previous. Each generation achieving slightly more than their parents, technology accumulating, knowledge expanding, until we arrive at the present, the most advanced, most knowledgeable, most sophisticated humans who have ever lived, standing at the pinnacle of a 10,000-year climb from agricultural villages to spacefaring civilization. This is what we teach. This is what students memorize. This is what the public believes. And this is what Gunung Padang destroys. Because if Gunung Padang is genuinely 27,000 years old, if Ice Age hunter-gatherers built a massive pyramid with sophisticated engineering and astronomical alignments, then the entire narrative collapses. The timeline is wrong. The progression is wrong. The assumptions about what hunter-gatherers could and could not achieve are wrong. Humans did not need agriculture to build monuments, did not need cities to organize large-scale labor, did not need writing to transmit complex knowledge across generations, did not need metal tools to work stone with precision. Everything we thought we knew about the prerequisites for civilization, about the necessary sequence of development, about when humans became capable of sophisticated achievement, is called into question by a single structure buried beneath an Indonesian hillside. The archaeological establishment resists Gunung Padang not because the evidence is weak but precisely because it might be strong. Because accepting the evidence would require dismantling a framework that has taken 200 years to construct. It would mean admitting that generations of archaeologists built their careers on incomplete information, on a chronology that was fundamentally compressed, on assumptions about human capability that were too conservative. It would mean rewriting textbooks, revising museum exhibits, rethinking entire fields of study, and most painfully for individuals who have devoted their lives to this work, it would mean acknowledging that they were wrong about something fundamental. That the story they told, the narrative they shaped and defended, was not the full truth. Not even close. This resistance follows a pattern that repeats throughout the history of science. Thomas Kuhn, in his influential work on scientific revolutions, described how paradigms, the fundamental frameworks through which scientists understand their field, resist change even in the face of contradictory evidence. Scientists do not abandon paradigms easily. They first try to incorporate anomalies, strange findings that do not quite fit, into the existing framework. They reinterpret the data, adjust the models, create exceptions and special cases. Only when anomalies accumulate beyond the point where the paradigm can accommodate them does a crisis develop. And only then, when an alternative paradigm emerges that can explain both the old data and the new anomalies, does a scientific revolution occur and the old paradigm get replaced. Archaeology is currently in the anomaly accumulation phase. Göbekli Tepe was the first major anomaly. A megalithic temple complex at 9600 BC forced archaeologists to acknowledge that monumental architecture predated agriculture and cities. The initial response was denial. The dates must be wrong. Hunter-gatherers could not build such structures. But as evidence accumulated, as more sites were excavated, as radiocarbon dates were verified and re-verified, denial became untenable, so the paradigm adjusted. Göbekli Tepe was incorporated as a special case, an exception. A unique cultural fluorescence enabled by abundant wild resources in one favorable region. Not evidence that the entire chronology needed revision, just an outlier, an anomaly that proved the rule. But then more anomalies appeared. A Toaik showing urban organization at 7500 BC, underwater sites suggesting sophisticated coastal settlements that were drowned by rising seas, genetic evidence revealing complex human migrations and interactions far earlier than expected, climate data from ice cores confirming catastrophic disruptions that would have devastated societies, and now Gunung Padang potentially pushing monumental architecture back to 27,000 BC, not 6,000 years before the conventional beginning of civilization, but 23,000 years before. This is not an anomaly that can be comfortably incorporated. This is a paradigm-shattering claim that, if accepted, requires rebuilding the entire chronological framework from first principles. The mainstream response has been predictable. Deny the dating, question the methodology, suggest contamination, argue that the structures are natural geological formations despite geophysical data showing clear artificial geometry, demand extraordinary proof while refusing to permit the excavation that would provide that proof. These are not scientific objections. These are defensive reactions from a paradigm under threat, because the paradigm cannot survive if Gunung Padang is real, cannot accommodate a 27,000-year-old pyramid without collapsing. So the pyramid cannot be allowed to be real, regardless of what the evidence shows. But the evidence keeps accumulating. And some researchers, particularly younger scholars not yet fully invested in the old paradigm, are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. If Göbekli Tepe is real, why not Gunung Padang? If monumental architecture existed at 9600 BC, why is 27,000 BC impossible? If Ice Age humans had the same brain capacity as modern humans, the same cognitive abilities, the same potential for cultural achievement, why assume they accomplished nothing for 90,000 years and then suddenly invented civilization in the last 10,000? That assumption has always been implausible. It requires believing that humans were capable but inactive, intelligent but uncreative, potential geniuses living like simple animals for thousands of generations without ever attempting to build, to organize, to create beyond immediate survival needs. The more plausible explanation, the one that Gunung Padang supports, is that Ice Age humans did build, did organize, did create, but most of their achievements were located on coastlines that are now underwater, in river valleys that became flooded estuaries, on plains that became shallow seas when the glaciers melted. The archaeological record appears empty not because Ice Age humans achieved little but because we are looking in the wrong places. On land that was marginal during the Ice Age and happens to still be above water today. While the prime real estate, the locations where complex societies would naturally develop, are now hundreds of feet underwater on continental shelves that we have barely begun to explore. Gunung Padang survived because it was inland and elevated. But it cannot have been unique. If one Ice Age society achieved this level of sophistication, others likely did as well, perhaps many others. And those others, if they were coastal or lowland, are now archaeologically invisible unless underwater archaeology discovers them. This explains the apparent gap, the supposed absence of Ice Age civilization, not because it did not exist, but because it is hidden beneath the oceans, accessible only through marine surveys that require resources and permissions that are rarely granted, because the paradigm says there is nothing there to find. A perfect self-reinforcing system. The paradigm predicts no Ice Age civilization. Therefore no resources are devoted to looking for it. Therefore none is found. Therefore the paradigm is confirmed. Gunung Padang breaks this cycle by existing on land where it cannot be ignored, where geophysical surveys can map its structure, where core samples can extract datable material, where the evidence can be examined, tested and verified, and the evidence points unmistakably to sophisticated construction during the Ice Age. Multiple independent dating methods converging on ages between 16,000 and 27,000 years. Geophysical data showing intentional architecture, geometric chambers, aligned passages, planned layouts. Construction techniques requiring organization, knowledge, and specialized skills. Everything needed to demonstrate that Ice Age humans were capable of achievements that the paradigm says were impossible. Some researchers have begun proposing alternative chronologies that incorporate these anomalies, rather than dismissing them. Graham Hancock has argued for decades that an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, was destroyed by the catastrophes that ended the Ice Age, particularly the Younger Dryas event around 10,800 BC, and that survivors of this lost civilization spread across the world, bringing knowledge that seeded later cultures. This would explain why similar myths, similar architectural styles, similar astronomical knowledge appears in widely separated regions, not because of independent invention or cultural diffusion during historical periods, but because all these later civilizations inherited fragments from a common Ice Age source. Mainstream archaeology has dismissed Hancock as a pseudoscientist, a popularizer making sensational claims without proper evidence. But Gunung Padang provides exactly the kind of evidence his theory predicts. An Ice Age structure showing sophisticated knowledge, multiple construction phases suggesting the site was built, abandoned during catastrophe, then rediscovered and rebuilt by later societies. Techniques and alignments that later cultures might have inherited as fragments of an older tradition. Hancock's theory, once considered fringe, begins to look plausible when physical evidence appears that matches its predictions. Robert Schoch, a geologist, has argued that the Great Sphinx of Egypt shows water erosion patterns consistent with heavy rainfall that has not occurred in the region since before 3000 BC. This would make the Sphinx thousands of years older than conventional Egyptology claims, possibly carved during the African humid period when the climate was wetter. Mainstream Egyptologists have rejected this interpretation, arguing that geologists do not understand the specific weathering patterns of Egyptian limestone. But Schoch is a geologist specializing in rock weathering. His expertise is directly relevant, and Gunung Padang, showing monumental construction potentially at 27,000 BC, makes an older sphinx suddenly more plausible. If pyramids existed in the Ice Age, why not sphinxes? Randall Carlson has documented extensive geological evidence for catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. Massive scablands in Washington state carved by sudden releases of glacial lake water. Eroded landscapes consistent with flows vastly larger than any modern river could produce. Evidence of rapid, violent climate changes that would have devastated any societies existing at the time. His work supports the idea that Ice Age civilizations were destroyed by natural catastrophes, their achievements erased by floods and climate chaos. Gunung Padang, surviving because it was elevated and inland, becomes evidence that such civilizations existed before the catastrophes struck. These alternative researchers, once dismissed as outsiders promoting fringe theories, are beginning to look prescient. They predicted that evidence of Ice Age sophistication would eventually be found, that anomalies would accumulate, that the conventional timeline would prove too compressed. And now that evidence is appearing, not from their own excavations, but from mainstream research like the Gunung Padang project, conducted by credentialed scientists using rigorous methodologies, published in peer-reviewed journals. The establishment is generating the very evidence that supports the alternative chronologies it has spent decades dismissing. The question becomes, which paradigm better explains the evidence? The conventional timeline, now strained by so many anomalies that it requires treating each new discovery as an exception, or a revised timeline that accepts Ice Age humans were capable of sophisticated achievement, that civilizations rose during the Ice Age, that catastrophes destroyed most evidence, and that later civilizations rebuilt from fragments. The revised timeline explains Göbekli Tepe without treating it as unique, explains Gunung Padang without dismissing its dates, explains the global flood myths without calling them fantasies, explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated techniques in early civilizations without assuming impossible inventive genius, and explains the archaeological gaps without requiring that humans accomplished nothing for 90,000 years. Science is supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, supposed to favor the explanation that best fits the data, supposed to abandon theories when they no longer work. But science is practiced by humans, and humans resist changing worldviews even when evidence demands it, particularly when careers, reputations, and institutional authority depend on the old worldview remaining intact. This is why paradigm shifts take so long, why Can observe that scientific revolutions often require the old guard to retire before new theories can be fully accepted. The defenders of the current paradigm will not change their minds no matter how much evidence accumulates. They will dismiss Gunung Padang, reject the dates, question the methodology, demand impossible standards of proof, and prevent excavation that might provide definitive answers. But the next generation of archaeologists, those not yet fully invested in defending the old chronology, may be more open. They grew up with Göbekli Tepe already established as real. They are comfortable with the idea that hunter-gatherers could build monuments. They have the tools to explore underwater sites. They understand genetics and climate science in ways that integrate with archaeology rather than existing as separate disciplines. And when they look at Gunung Padang, they may not see a threat to defend against. They may see what it actually is, a discovery, evidence, a piece of the puzzle that expands our understanding rather than destroying it, a window into a past that is longer stranger and more sophisticated than we have been allowed to believe. The timeline will change. Paradigms always do eventually, when the weight of contradicting evidence becomes too great to ignore. The question is only how long the resistance will last, how many more discoveries will be dismissed before acceptance becomes inevitable, how much knowledge will remain buried, literally and figuratively, because acknowledging it threatens those who built careers on chronologies that are increasingly indefensible. Gunung Padang may be the discovery that finally breaks the paradigm, or it may be one more anomaly, one more piece of evidence filed away, unexamined and unexcavated, while the old guard maintains control and delays the inevitable. Either way, the stones beneath the Indonesian hillside know the truth, have known it for 27,000 years, and will continue knowing it, patient and permanent, until humanity finally develops the courage to listen to what they are saying. That we are not the first, that civilization is far older than we have admitted, that the timeline is wrong, and that history, when we finally allow ourselves to see it clearly, is going to look very different than we have been taught. Not a story of steady progress from primitive to advanced, of rise and fall, of achievement and catastrophe, of knowledge gained and lost and slowly recovered, a story that Gunung Padang has preserved, a story that we are only now beginning to read, a story that, if we are wise enough to learn from it, might teach us something essential about what it means to be human, and what it means when human civilizations forget that they are not permanent, that they can fall, that they have fallen before, and that the cycle, perhaps, is preparing to turn again. A 356 words, if we accept the evidence from Gunung Padang, if we allow ourselves to believe that the radiocarbon dates are accurate, that the geophysical surveys are revealing artificial structures, that Ice Age humans built a massive pyramid in Indonesia 27,000 years ago, then we must confront implications that extend far beyond archaeology. Implications about who we are as a species, about what we are capable of, about the nature of human history, about the fragility of civilization, about cycles that repeat across timescales so vast they dwarf our recorded past. These implications are not abstract academic questions. They touch the foundations of how we understand ourselves, our achievements, our place in the long arc of human existence. And they carry warnings that we ignore at our peril. The first and most immediate implication is that human capability has been drastically underestimated. For over a century, archaeology has operated on the assumption that cognitive sophistication, the ability to plan long-term projects, to organize large groups, to develop specialized knowledge and transmit it across generations, emerged only recently in human history. That our Ice Age ancestors were cognitively modern, meaning they had the same brain capacity as us, but culturally primitive, meaning they had not yet developed the social structures and technological knowledge that characterize civilization. This assumption created a puzzle. If they had the same brains as us, why did they accomplish so little for so long? Why did 90,000 years pass between the emergence of anatomically modern humans and the first cities? Why did intelligence not translate into achievement until the last tiny fraction of human existence? The conventional answer has been that intelligence alone is not enough, that civilization requires specific environmental conditions, abundant food sources that allow sedentary life, agricultural surplus that enables specialization, population density that drives innovation through competition and exchange, and that these conditions only appeared after the Ice Age ended, after climate stabilized, after humans invented agriculture and began the long climb from villages to cities to states. Ice Age humans had potential but lacked opportunity. They were smart but stuck in environments too harsh and unstable to allow complex society to develop. Gonung Padang challenges this entire framework. If Ice Age humans built sophisticated structures, organized large labor forces, understood engineering and astronomy well enough to create monuments aligned to celestial coordinates, then they were not limited by cognitive capacity or environmental constraints. They were capable, they achieved, they created. And the absence of widespread evidence for Ice Age civilization is not because they could not build, but because most of what they built was located on coastlines that are now underwater, in regions that experienced catastrophic climate disruptions, in contexts that left minimal archaeological traces. The puzzle is not why they achieved so little. The puzzle is why we have found so little of what they achieved. This shift in perspective is profound. It means that for most of human existence, we have been capable of everything we accomplish today. The potential was always there. Intelligence, creativity, organizational ability, all present for tens of thousands of years. Civilization is not a recent invention, a breakthrough that occurred only in the last few thousand years. Civilization is something humans do, something we have done repeatedly, something that rises and falls, emerges and collapses, appears and disappears across cycles, so long that memory of previous iterations fades into myth and then into silence. We are not the first civilized humans, we are simply the latest. And that realization carries uncomfortable implications about permanence, about progress, about the assumption that we are building towards something, rather than repeating something. The second implication concerns the nature of knowledge transmission. If sophisticated societies existed during the Ice Age and were destroyed or disrupted by the catastrophes that ended the Ice Age, particularly the Younger Dryas event around 10,800 BC, how did any knowledge survive? How did anything transfer from the pre-catastrophe world to the post-catastrophe civilizations that emerged thousands of years later? The answer appears to be fragments, oral traditions, myths, ritual practices that preserved techniques without preserving understanding of why those techniques mattered, architectural motifs copied by later builders who no longer knew their original significance, astronomical alignments maintained because ancestors said they were important, even when the reasons were forgotten. This fragmented transmission explains many puzzles in the archaeological record. Why writing appears suddenly in Sumer around 3200 BC, fully formed with no visible developmental stages. Perhaps because the Sumerians were not inventing writing but restoring it, recreating a system that had existed before the catastrophes, working from oral traditions and fragments that preserve the concept if not the full details. Why Egyptian pyramid construction shows such sophistication from the earliest examples, as if the builders already knew what they were doing rather than learning through trial and error. Perhaps because they were following templates inherited from earlier traditions, rebuilding from memory what ancestors had built before. Why megalithic sites worldwide share common features: astronomical alignments, geometric precision, massive stone construction requiring organizational capacity. Perhaps because these features were not independently invented in each region, but represented fragments of a shared Ice Age tradition, preserved through the catastrophes by survivors who scattered across the world, each group carrying pieces of knowledge that they passed to descendants who eventually rebuilt when conditions stabilized. This would explain the global distribution of flood myths, all describing the same sequence: advanced world destroyed by water, survivors preserving fragments, slow rebuilding. The myths are not religious fantasies, they are compressed historical memory, oral traditions maintaining information about real events across so many generations that details blurred into mythology, but the core truth survived. If this interpretation is correct, then everything we call the beginning of civilization is actually resumption, restoration, rebuilding from fragments of something older that was almost entirely lost. The Neolithic Revolution was not the invention of agriculture but its reinvention, possibly from knowledge that Ice Age societies had developed, and that survived in fragmented form through oral traditions maintained by scattered survivor populations. The first cities were not humanity's first attempt at urban organization, but the first attempt after the catastrophes, built by people working from inherited concepts, partial knowledge, memories of how ancestors had organized before the old world fell. This creates a very different narrative of human progress. Not linear advancement from primitive to advanced, but cyclical. Achievements followed by catastrophes followed by rebuilding from fragments, each cycle potentially reaching heights comparable to or exceeding previous cycles, each collapse erasing most evidence, leaving only scattered remnants that later societies struggle to understand and replicate. We are not climbing steadily towards some future pinnacle. We are recovering from a past collapse, rebuilding toward levels that may have been reached before, that may have been exceeded before, by societies whose full achievements we can barely glimpse because catastrophe erased them so thoroughly. The third implication concerns vulnerability. If advanced Ice Age civilizations were destroyed by natural catastrophes, by climate chaos, by cosmic impacts, by sea level rise drowning coastal settlements, then our current civilization faces the same vulnerabilities. We are not immune to the forces that reset previous cycles. We are not protected by our technology or our knowledge. In some ways, we are more vulnerable than Ice Age societies because we have concentrated so much population, so much infrastructure, so much essential knowledge in coastal cities and low-lying areas that would be catastrophically impacted by sea level rise or major climate disruption. 70% of the world's population lives within 50 miles of a coastline. Our major cities, New York, Tokyo, Mumbai, Shanghai, Jakarta, are built at or near sea level. Our ports, our trade networks, our communication hubs, all concentrated in the zones most vulnerable to flooding. If sea levels rose rapidly, as they did at the end of the Ice Age when meltwater pulses raised oceans by dozens of feet within centuries, our civilization would face collapse on a scale that makes historical catastrophes seem trivial. Billions of people would be displaced. Infrastructure would be destroyed, supply chains would fragment, and knowledge, our vast accumulated technological and scientific knowledge, much of it stored in data centers located in coastal cities, much of it dependent on complex global systems that require stable conditions to maintain, could be lost or rendered inaccessible within a generation. Ice Age civilizations, if they existed, at least had the advantage of being distributed. If one coastal settlement was destroyed, others elsewhere might survive. Knowledge was probably replicated across multiple centers. But our civilization is globally integrated in ways that create systemic vulnerabilities. A catastrophe that disrupts one region cascades through the entire network. Financial systems, power grids, internet infrastructure, all interconnected, all dependent on stability. A major disruption could propagate globally within days or weeks, and recovery would be hampered by the fact that we have lost local resilience, local self-sufficiency, in favor of global specialization and just-in-time supply chains that are efficient under normal conditions but fragile when conditions change. The Younger Dryas event, if caused by cosmic impact as growing evidence suggests, demonstrates that catastrophic threats remain possible. Asteroids and comets continue to orbit through the solar system. Large impacts are rare on human timescales but inevitable on geological timescales. We have some monitoring systems, some early warning capability, some theoretical plans for deflection if we detect an object on collision course with Earth. But we have never tested these systems under real conditions, never attempted to deflect an actual threat. If another Younger Dryas scale impact occurred, we might have years of warning or we might have days. And our ability to protect our civilization, to preserve our knowledge, to ensure that descendants could rebuild rather than starting from scratch, remains uncertain. Climate change presents a slower but equally serious threat, not because our civilization will be destroyed by rising temperatures alone, but because climate disruption creates cascading failures. Agricultural systems optimized for current climate patterns failing as those patterns shift. Water supplies in some regions increasing while others face drought. Coastal flooding forcing mass migrations that create political instability and conflict. Each of these stresses manageable individually but potentially catastrophic in combination. Ice Age civilizations, if they existed, likely collapsed not from a single catastrophe but from accumulating stresses. Climate instability during the Younger Dryas making food production unreliable. Population decline from starvation and conflict. Social systems fragmenting. And then the floods as the ice melted, destroying what remained of coastal settlements, scattering survivors, severing transmission chains that carried knowledge. A slow-motion collapse spanning centuries, erasing a world. We face similar accumulating stresses. And the lesson from Gunung Padang, if we are willing to learn it, is that advanced civilizations can fall. That sophistication does not guarantee survival. That knowledge can be lost. That cycles repeat. That we should not assume permanence. Should not believe ourselves immune to the forces that destroyed our predecessors. Should prepare, should preserve, should maintain resilience rather than assuming that progress is inevitable and collapse impossible. But this is precisely the lesson that institutional archaeology resists hearing, because accepting it requires accepting fallibility, accepting that we might not survive, accepting that our current cycle might end as previous cycles did, leaving only fragments for future archaeologists to puzzle over, wondering how we achieved so much and why we failed to survive. This acceptance is psychologically difficult, culturally unwelcome. It contradicts the narrative of progress that modern civilization tells itself, that we are improving, advancing, building toward a better future, that each generation stands on the shoulders of previous generations, seeing further, achieving more, that setbacks are temporary and overall trajectory is upward. Gunung Padang whispers a different story, that civilizations rise and civilizations fall, that the trajectory is not linear but cyclical, that what we are building may collapse as others collapsed before, that our knowledge may be lost as theirs was lost, that descendants may struggle to recover fragments, to rebuild from ruins, to remember that we existed at all, and that the cycle, the long terrible cycle of rise and catastrophe and rebuilding, may be the fundamental pattern of human history rather than the anomaly we hope it is. This is why the resistance to Gunung Padang is so fierce. Not because the evidence is weak, not because the methodology is flawed, but because accepting the implications is unbearable. It means admitting that we are not special, not unique, not the first to achieve sophistication, and certainly not guaranteed to be the last. It means acknowledging that we might fail, that our civilization could join the Ice Age societies in the archaeological record. Our ruins studied by distant descendants who argue about whether we were really as advanced as our artifacts suggest, who dismiss our achievements as impossible for our era, who compress our entire history into a brief footnote before moving on to discuss their own concerns. The academic resistance to paradigm, threatening discoveries like Gunung Padang, is ultimately resistance to this existential realization. As long as we can maintain that civilization began with Sumer, that everything before was primitive, that Ice Age humans accomplished nothing worthy of the term civilization, then we can tell ourselves we are the beginning of something. The first, the pioneers, building toward a future that will be greater than the past, because the past was empty. But if Ice Age civilizations existed and fell, if we are merely the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated before and may repeat again, then we are not pioneers, we are inheritors. Inheritors of a pattern, and that pattern includes collapse as surely as it includes achievement. Danny Hillman and his team face resistance not because they are wrong but because they might be right. Because if Gunung Padang is genuinely 27,000 years old, if the radiocarbon dates are accurate, if the structure represents Ice Age engineering and organization, then everything changes. The comfortable timeline collapses. The narrative of progress becomes questionable. The assumption of permanence becomes untenable. And the warnings encoded in myths, in flood traditions, in stories of lost golden ages, become relevant again. Not as primitive superstition but as historical memory. Not as fantasy but as warning. The ancestors tried to tell us, tried to preserve the knowledge that civilizations fall, that catastrophes happen, that we should prepare, should remember, should not assume ourselves immune. But we did not listen, dismissed the myths as stories, dismissed the alternative chronologies as pseudoscience, dismissed Göbekli Tepe as anomaly, and now dismiss Gunung Padang with the same arguments, the same defensive reactions, the same refusal to consider implications. The pattern of resistance is itself a warning that we are not learning, not hearing, not preparing, that we would rather maintain comfortable illusions than confront uncomfortable truths, that we will defend paradigms even when evidence demands their revision, that we will suppress discoveries that threaten institutional authority, that we will prevent excavation, deny funding, block publication, anything to delay the moment when we must acknowledge what the stones are saying. Meanwhile, Gunung Padang continues to sit beneath its covering of soil and jungle vegetation. The underground chambers remain sealed, the passages unexplored, the full extent of the structure unmapped, and the Indonesian government, pressured by the archaeological establishment, maintains restrictions on excavation pending review that has not occurred and may never occur. The site that could provide definitive answers to questions about Ice Age civilization, that could resolve debates about human capability and chronology, that could teach us essential lessons about cycles and catastrophes and the fragility of knowledge, remains mostly buried, not because excavation is impossible, not because resources are lacking, but because those who control access to the site have decided, consciously or unconsciously, that some questions are better left unanswered, that some knowledge is too threatening to pursue, that maintaining paradigms is more important than discovering truth. This is how civilizations ensure they learn nothing from their predecessors. By refusing to acknowledge those predecessors existed, by dismissing evidence, by preventing investigation, by maintaining willful ignorance in the face of accumulating data that demands revision of comfortable assumptions. Ice Age civilizations, if they existed, probably made similar choices, probably ignored warnings, probably maintained comfortable illusions until catastrophe made those illusions untenable, and probably, in their final days, wished they had listened, wished they had prepared, wished they had learned from whoever came before them. But by then it was too late. The catastrophes were upon them. Their world was ending, and all they could do was preserve fragments, bury monuments, pass on oral traditions, and hope that descendants thousands of years later would be wiser, would learn, would break the cycle. We are those descendants. We found their monument. We developed the technology to date it. We have the knowledge to understand what it represents. The question is whether we have the wisdom to learn from it, to accept what it teaches about cycles, about vulnerability, about the impermanence of civilization, to prepare rather than assuming we are immune, to preserve knowledge in resilient forms rather than concentrating it in fragile systems, to maintain humility about our place in the long arc of human history rather than assuming we stand at its pinnacle. These are the lessons Gunung Padang offers. These are the implications its existence carries. And these are precisely the lessons that institutional resistance prevents us from learning. Not because the evidence is absent, but because accepting the evidence requires accepting our own mortality as a civilization, requires acknowledging that we might fail, that the cycle might claim us as it claimed our predecessors, that the stones we leave behind might be all that survives, and that future archaeologists, if there are any, might stand where we stood, looking at our ruins, arguing about whether we were truly advanced or merely primitive peoples who got lucky for a while before the inevitable collapse. The choice is ours. Learn from Gunung Padang or ignore it, accept the warnings or maintain the illusions, prepare for cycles or assume permanence. The stones have spoken. After 27,000 years of silence, they have finally found voices willing to listen. The only question is whether we are willing to hear what they are saying. While there is still time, while we still have the option to choose a different path than the civilizations that came before us chose, before the cycle turns, before our world ends, before we become the next lost civilization that future discoverers argue about, wondering if we knew, wondering if we were warned, wondering if we simply chose not to listen. The builders of Gunung Padang left us a message, not written in words that we can read directly, not inscribed on tablets that spell out their intentions, but encoded in stone and geometry and astronomical alignment. A message that transcends language, that survives the erosion of millennia, that speaks across 27,000 years to anyone with the tools and the will to listen. The message is both simple and profound. We were here, we built, we knew, and what happened to us can happen to you. This is not speculation, not romantic interpretation of ancient monuments. This is what the evidence tells us when we examine it honestly, when we set aside the defensive reactions and paradigm protection and simply look at what the stones reveal. They reveal a society capable of quarrying massive basalt columns, transporting them across difficult terrain, and arranging them with precision that required understanding of structural engineering, load distribution, and architectural planning. They reveal knowledge of astronomy sophisticated enough to align the structure to cardinal directions with accuracy that demands systematic observation of celestial movements. They reveal organization on a scale that required coordinating hundreds or thousands of workers, feeding them, housing them, directing their labor toward a long-term project that would take years or decades to complete. They reveal all of this from 27,000 years ago, from deep in the last ice age, from a time when conventional archaeology claims humans were primitive hunter-gatherers incapable of such achievements. And they reveal something else, something more troubling. They reveal that this sophisticated society, this ice age civilization that built monuments we can still detect today, disappeared. The structure was buried, either by natural processes as soil accumulated over millennia, or by intentional concealment as the builders tried to preserve their greatest achievement before catastrophe struck. The construction stopped, the knowledge degraded. When later societies rediscovered the site thousands of years afterward, they built new structures on top, maintaining some elements of the tradition but unable to match the scale and sophistication of the deepest layers. This pattern of sophisticated beginnings followed by decline, of knowledge lost rather than accumulated, appears nowhere in the conventional narrative of human progress. But it appears clearly in the stratigraphy of Gunung Padang. The warning embedded in this pattern is clear. Civilization is fragile, knowledge can be lost. Achievements that seem permanent can vanish within a few generations if the social systems that maintain them collapse. The Ice Age builders probably thought their world was stable, probably assumed that what they knew would be passed to their children, that what they built would stand for ages, that their civilization would endure. But something happened. Climate chaos during the Younger Dryas period, cosmic impacts triggering catastrophic environmental changes, sea level rise drowning coastal settlements, population collapse, social fragmentation, and the knowledge that had accumulated over perhaps thousands of years, the engineering expertise, the astronomical observations, the organizational structures, all of it threatened with extinction. Some knowledge survived, enough that when later societies encountered the buried structure, they recognized it as significant, recognized it as connected to their own origins or traditions, and attempted to continue what had been started, building new layers according to similar principles, using similar materials, maintaining similar alignments. But they could not fully replicate what the original builders had achieved. The sophistication declined with each reconstruction phase. The scale became smaller, the techniques simpler, as if each generation was working from more fragmentary knowledge than the previous, as if the transmission chains were degrading, as if memory was fading even as people tried desperately to maintain it. This is what collapse looks like in the archaeological record. Not sudden apocalyptic destruction leaving everything frozen in a moment like Pompeii, but slow erosion, knowledge holders dying without fully training successors, trade networks that supplied specialized materials fragmenting, organizational capacity to coordinate large projects diminishing as populations declined and social complexity decreased, each generation inheriting less than the previous, each cycle of rebuilding achieving less than the previous peak, until eventually, the original achievement becomes so distant, so dimly remembered, that descendants no longer understand what their ancestors accomplished. The monuments remain, mysterious and impressive, but the knowledge of how to build them, why they were built, what they meant, all lost to time. We see this pattern in historical collapses. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, European civilization lost concrete technology, lost the engineering knowledge to build aqueducts and monumental architecture on the Roman scale, lost literacy rates that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. After the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean lost writing systems, lost trade networks, lost political structures, entering a dark age from which recovery took centuries. Each collapse erased knowledge, each recovery rebuilt from fragments, and each time, contemporaries probably did not realize they were experiencing collapse. Probably thought the difficulties were temporary. Probably believed recovery was just around the corner. Probably maintained illusions of permanence until those illusions became untenable. Gonung Padang warns us that the same pattern can repeat on timescales far longer than historical memory preserves. That civilizations can rise and fall across tens of thousands of years. That we are not the first to achieve sophistication. That others came before. That they reached heights we are only now beginning to recognize. That catastrophes struck them. That their worlds ended. That knowledge they had accumulated over millennia was almost entirely lost. And that we, their distant descendants, are only now recovering enough fragments to understand what we lost, what they tried to preserve, what warnings they attempted to encode in the only medium that could survive the catastrophes that claimed everything else. Stone, massive, precisely arranged, deliberately buried stone that could outlast floods, climate chaos, social collapse, and the erosion of 27,000 years. The question is whether we will heed the warning, whether we will learn from their fate, whether we will prepare for the possibility that our own cycle might end as theirs did, or whether we will do what every civilization apparently does, assume ourselves unique, assume ourselves permanent, assume that progress is linear and collapse impossible, assume that the warnings are not meant for us, that we are different, that we are special, that we have achieved a level of knowledge and control that makes us immune to the forces that destroyed our predecessors. The evidence suggests this assumption is not just wrong but dangerously wrong. We face the same vulnerabilities that Ice Age civilizations faced. Cosmic impacts remain possible. Asteroids and comets continue to orbit through the solar system on trajectories that occasionally intersect Earth. Large impacts are rare on human timescales but inevitable on geological timescales. The Younger Dryas event, if caused by impact as growing evidence suggests, occurred only 12,800 years ago. A blink in geological time. There is no reason to believe such events cannot recur. And while we have some monitoring systems, some early warning capabilities, we have never successfully deflected a large object on collision course with Earth. Never tested our theories under real conditions. Our preparations remain theoretical at best. Climate change presents a different but equally serious threat, not because rising temperatures alone will destroy our civilization, but because climate disruption creates cascading failures that stress every system we depend on. Agricultural zones shifting as temperature and precipitation patterns change. Water supplies in some regions increasing while others face catastrophic drought. Sea levels rising as ice sheets melt, threatening coastal cities where billions live. Mass migrations as regions become uninhabitable, creating political instability and conflict. Each stress manageable individually, but potentially catastrophic in combination, particularly if they interact in ways that exceed our capacity to adapt. And adaptation requires resources, organization, global cooperation. The very things that become scarce during crises. The very things that Ice Age civilizations probably possessed before the catastrophes struck, and lost as their worlds collapsed. We are no different. Our technological sophistication does not make us immune. In some ways it makes us more vulnerable because our systems are optimized for stable conditions, for just-in-time supply chains, for global specialization rather than local resilience. We have built a civilization that is extraordinarily efficient under normal conditions, but fragile when conditions change. A civilization where the failure of one critical node can cascade through the entire network. Where knowledge is concentrated in vulnerable locations, stored in formats that require complex systems to access, dependent on infrastructure that requires stability to maintain. If a major disruption occurred, if sea levels rose rapidly as they did at the end of the Ice Age, if climate became unstable as it did during the Younger Dryas, if cosmic impact triggered environmental chaos, our ability to preserve knowledge for descendants would be limited. Data centers would flood, power grids would fail. The internet, our vast distributed repository of human knowledge, requires constant maintenance and energy input. Without those it goes dark within days. Physical books remain, but increasingly we have moved knowledge into digital formats that require functioning technology to access. If that technology fails, if the expertise to maintain it is lost, future generations might find themselves surrounded by servers they cannot read, with hard drives they cannot access, in buildings they do not understand, like finding an ancient library written in a language no one can decipher. This is what knowledge loss looks like. Not dramatic book burnings, not deliberate destruction, but gradual erosion as the systems that maintain knowledge fail and cannot be restored. Ice Age civilizations probably did not destroy their own knowledge. They lost it because catastrophes disrupted the social structures that preserved and transmitted it. Because teachers died before training successors. Because libraries were abandoned as populations fled. Because survival became more important than preservation. And within a few generations, knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate existed only in fragments, in oral traditions, in myths that preserved the memory of a golden age, when ancestors knew more, built better, achieved greater things before the world changed and forced humanity to start over. We are in danger of repeating this pattern. Not because we lack the capability to preserve knowledge, but because we lack the will to acknowledge the danger. Because institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths prevents us from preparing. Because paradigm protection takes priority over learning from evidence. Because we would rather maintain illusions of permanence than confront the possibility that our civilization could fail. Gunung Padang offers us a chance to break this pattern. Offers us evidence that cycles exist, that civilizations fall, that we should prepare. But we are refusing the gift, suppressing the evidence, preventing excavation, dismissing the implications, doing exactly what collapsing civilizations probably do, maintaining comfortable narratives until maintaining them becomes impossible. The builders of Gunung Padang tried to send a message across 27,000 years. They built in stone because stone survives. They buried the structure because burial preserves. They aligned it to celestial coordinates because astronomy transcends language and culture. They created something that would outlast everything else, that would survive catastrophes that claimed their entire world, that would speak to whoever came after about what had existed and what had been lost. And the message, when we finally have the tools to read it, says we were here, we achieved, we knew, and then our world ended. Learn from us, prepare better than we did, preserve what matters, do not assume permanence, do not forget that cycles turn, do not repeat our mistakes. But we are not listening. We found the message. We developed the technology to date it, to understand what it represents. We have the knowledge to learn from it. But we have chosen, collectively and institutionally, to ignore it, to dismiss the evidence, to prevent further investigation, to maintain paradigms that the evidence contradicts, to preserve comfortable illusions rather than confront uncomfortable truths. And in doing so, we are ensuring that when our own cycle ends, when our own civilization faces its catastrophes, we will be as unprepared as the Ice Age builders were. We will lose knowledge as they lost it. We will fragment as they fragmented, and distant descendants, if there are any, will wonder why we failed to learn, why we ignored the warnings, why we chose not to listen when the stones finally spoke after 27,000 years of silence. There is still time. Gunung Padang remains mostly unexcavated. The underground chambers are sealed but accessible. Full investigation could provide definitive answers about Ice Age civilization, about the extent of their knowledge, about how they organized, about what ultimately happened to them. We could learn lessons that might help us avoid their fate, could understand patterns that repeat, could prepare for catastrophes that seem impossible until they happen, could preserve knowledge in forms that would survive disruptions, could build resilience into our systems instead of optimizing only for efficiency, could acknowledge our vulnerability instead of assuming our invincibility. But this requires changing course, requires overcoming institutional resistance, requires funding excavation that the establishment opposes, requires accepting paradigm shifts that threaten careers and reputations, requires humility about how much we do not know and how wrong we might be about fundamental assumptions. These are not easy requirements. They demand courage, vision, willingness to prioritize truth over comfort, learning over defending, future over present, qualities that civilizations in decline typically lack, qualities that we are demonstrating we lack through our response to Gunung Padang. And so the cycle continues. The evidence accumulates, the paradigm resists, the excavation is delayed, the knowledge remains buried, both literally in the chambers beneath the Indonesian hillside and figuratively in the institutional refusal to acknowledge what the evidence reveals. And we move closer to our own catastrophes, whatever form they will take, cosmic or climatic or some combination we have not anticipated, without learning from the civilizations that came before, without heeding the warnings they left, without preparing for possibilities that seem remote until they are immediate, and then it is too late. Late at night, in the highlands of West Java, Gunung Padang sits silent beneath its covering of earth and vegetation. Pilgrims still climb the terraced slopes, seeking spiritual enlightenment, unaware of what lies beneath their feet, unaware that the mountain they consider sacred is not a mountain at all but a pyramid, the oldest pyramid on earth, built by people with names we will never know, for purposes we can only guess. You should not have existed 27,000 years ago, built and buried again. Layer upon layer of construction spanning 25,000 years, each phase representing a society trying to continue what ancestors started, trying to maintain connections to origins they no longer fully understood, trying to preserve something essential across catastrophes that erased almost everything else. The chambers remain sealed, 100 feet below the surface, stone passages that have known no footsteps since the Ice Age, spaces that might contain artifacts, might hold answers, might teach us essential lessons about who we are, and where we came from and what warnings we should heed. But permission to excavate has not been granted. The Indonesian government maintains restrictions pending review that has lasted years and may last years more. The archaeological establishment continues to argue that the dates must be wrong, the structures must be natural, the entire claim must be flawed because accepting it requires admitting they were wrong about something fundamental. And so the knowledge waits, patient, eternal, preserved in stone that will outlast our civilization as it outlasted the civilizations that built it. Perhaps someday, perhaps when our own cycle has turned, when our own catastrophes have struck, when our own descendants are rebuilding from fragments and wondering about the ancestors who came before, perhaps they will excavate Gunung Padang fully, will explore the chambers, will recover what we failed to recover, will learn what we refused to learn, will find not just the chambers built by Ice Age societies but the chambers we built, the data centers we left behind, the ruins of our own civilization layered above theirs. And they will wonder, as we wonder about the Ice Age builders, whether we knew, whether we were warned, whether we tried to preserve knowledge for them, whether we understood that cycles turn and civilizations fall, and that we were not immune to the forces that destroyed those who came before. And the stones, the ancient basalt columns arranged with such precision 27,000 years ago, will still be there, still aligned to celestial coordinates that do not change though civilizations rise and fall around them, still holding their message, still speaking to anyone willing to listen, saying what they have always said, what they will always say, across however many more cycles turn, however many more civilizations rise and fall, however many more times humanity has to learn the same lessons because we refuse to remember them. We were here, we built, we knew, and then our world ended. Learn from us, prepare better than we did, preserve what matters. Do not assume permanence. Do not forget that cycles turn. Do not repeat our mistakes. This is the warning. This is what Gunung Padang has been trying to tell us for 27,000 years. This is what we have finally found but refuse to hear. This is what will remain true whether we accept it or deny it, whether we prepare or ignore, whether we learn or repeat. The warning is not negotiable. The cycles are not optional. The fragility of civilization is not debatable. And the choice is whether to acknowledge reality and prepare accordingly, or maintain illusions and face catastrophe unprepared. The stones have spoken. After 27,000 years, they have finally found voices willing to announce their existence. The technology exists to reveal their secrets. The knowledge exists to understand their message. The evidence exists to prove we are not the first. The only question remaining is whether we have the wisdom to listen. Whether we can overcome our resistance to uncomfortable truths. Whether we can accept that we are part of a cycle, not the beginning of a line. Whether we can learn from those who came before, instead of assuming they have nothing to teach us. Whether we can break the pattern instead of repeating it. Time will tell. But the stones will remain, patient, permanent, holding their warning, waiting for someone someday to finally hear, to finally understand, to finally learn, before it is too late, before our cycle ends, before we become the next lost civilization that future archaeologists argue about, the next layer of construction that distant descendants excavate, the next warning that no one heeds. The choice is ours. The warning is clear. The evidence is available. The question is whether we are brave enough, wise enough, humble enough to accept what it tells us. That we are not the first. That we will not be the last. That cycles turn. That civilizations fall. And that the only way to break the pattern is to remember that it exists. To learn from those who forgot. To prepare for what they failed to survive. To preserve what they lost. And to build, if we are wise, not just for ourselves but for those who will come